Welcome back to the quiet corners of history. Tonight we slow our breath and wander into the hush between heartbeats, into a place where summer itself seemed to pause and listen. It is July 1st, 1863. We arrive in southern Pennsylvania, where rolling farmland, quiet woodlots, and golden fields stretch gently beneath a sky heavy with warmth. The small town of Gettysburg sleeps at the crossroads of dusty roads and peaceful orchards, unaware that its name is about to echo through eternity. The air carries the sweetness of wild grass and ripe fruit, drifting lazily over split rail fences. Cicadas hum their endless lullaby, and soft winds brush through wheat like whispered footsteps. Yet beneath this calm, tension gathers like distant thunder, low, inevitable, unshakable. Two great armies, weary from months of conflict, converge here not by grand design, but by fate's quiet insistence. The Union and the Confederacy, brothers, divided by conviction and wounded pride, are drawn toward a collision that will reshape a nation's soul. Horses shift in the shade, steel rests against cloth, and boots press lightly into sacred earth. This is not only a battlefield, it is a crossroads of hope, loss, and the fragile weight of tomorrow. Close your eyes now. Let history's distant murmur cradle you as we drift into the story of Gettysburg, where the world changed in the stillness of a Pennsylvania dawn. The American summer of 1863 draped itself over a divided nation with a weight that was both meteorological and metaphysical. For nearly 2 years the Civil War had ground on, evolving from a parade ground adventure into a devouring reality. Beyond the battlefields, the social order of a continent hung in a precarious balance, its disruption already profound, but its final shape still shrouded in the smoke of countless engagements. In the north, the industrial machine hummed, fueled by immigration and a still evolving commitment to the twin causes of union and increasingly emancipation. In the south, an agrarian aristocracy clung to a way of life defined by land and lineage, a feudal dream in the modern age, fighting with a desperate ferocity to preserve its world. The conflict had ceased to be a mere political disagreement. It had become a contest over the soul of the nation's future, a brutal referendum on the meaning of the republic itself. Into this cauldron stepped the principal actors, men whose decisions would soon crystallize in the Pennsylvania countryside. General Robert E. Lee, commanding the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, was more than a military leader. He was a symbol, an icon of duty and martial nobility. Yet beneath the calm patrician exterior lay a man burdened by the suffering of his soldiers and the escalating cost of a war he had once opposed. His ambition was not for personal glory, but for a decisive, war-ending victory on northern soil, a stroke so sharp it would pierce the northern will to fight. He feared a protracted war of attrition his fledgling nation could not win, and he carried the quiet contradiction of a man fighting to preserve a system of slavery while personally finding it a moral evil. Opposing him, though not yet in command, was a Union Army of the Potomac perennially shadowed by failure and frustrated ambition. Its officers, men like the charismatic but cautious Joseph Hooker or the intellectual Darius Couch, laboured under the long, dark shadow of their previous commander, George McClellan, and the incessant, impatient gaze of Washington politicians. The Army of Northern Virginia, however, was not a monolith of unified purpose. It pulsed with hidden tensions and rivalries that simmered just below the surface of military discipline. Lee's trusted old war horse, Lieutenant General James Longstreet, brooded with a pragmatic mind. He believed in defensive warfare, in forcing the Union to attack well-entrenched positions, a philosophy that clashed with Lee's instinct for the audacious offensive. Theirs was a clash of strategic doctrines wrapped in deep personal affection and respect, a tension unresolved and about to be tested on the grandest stage. Elsewhere, the fiery cavalryman J.E.B. Stuart harboured a love for glory and dramatic reconnaissance that sometimes verged on the insubordinate, while corps commanders like A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell, newly promoted after the death of the legendary Stonewall Jackson, wrestled with the ghosts of their predecessor and their own capacities for independent command. The Confederate Army was a razor-sharp instrument, but one with subtle, hidden fissures in its steel. The Union Army, for its part, was a mosaic of discord and political intrigue. Abraham Lincoln in the White House was a figure of profound melancholy and iron resolve, seeking a general who would fight without ceasing. His relationship with his military commanders was a saga of disappointment and micromanagement born of desperation. Within the Army of the Potomac, a poisonous rivalry festered between the corps commanders, men who jockeyed for position and whispered against one another, their allegiances divided between different schools of thought and different patrons in Washington. The army lacked a unifying, trusted spirit. It moved not as a confident entity, but as a mechanical behemoth, responsive to orders yet devoid of inspired zeal. It was an army waiting for a catalyst, for a moment that would either shatter it completely or forge it finally into a weapon of decisive purpose. The incident that would destabilize this fragile military status quo began not with a shot, but with a movement. In early June, Lee made the momentous decision to shift the war northward. Disengaging from Fredericksburg, Virginia, his army slipped away, screened by the rolling hills and Stuart's cavalry, marching northwest toward the Shenandoah Valley. This was no mere raid, it was a strategic invasion, a profound escalation. The presence of a major Confederate army on Union soil was an electric shock to the North, a direct threat to cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and even Washington itself. It forced reaction, panic, and a desperate scrambling of forces. For the common soldier in blue, the news meant leaving the familiar, if bloody, grounds of Virginia and marching to defend their own hearths. For Lee, it was a colossal gamble, moving his army like a queen across the chessboard, risking his line of communication and his very army in the hope of a checkmate. The status quo of the Virginia theatre was irrevocably broken. The war had come home to the North, and every decision from this point would carry the weight of potential national collapse or salvation. As Lee's infantry columns, miles long, snaked their way through the verdant valleys of Maryland and into Pennsylvania, the Union High Command was thrown into a paroxysm of uncertainty and alarm. The initial destabilizing incident of the invasion now demanded a reaction, but the mechanism for that reaction was itself flawed. General Joseph Hooker, commanding the Army of the Potomac, proposed bold countermeasures, including a strike at Richmond, now lightly defended. But his relationship with Washington, particularly with General-in-Chief Henry Halleck and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, had eroded into one of mutual contempt and distrust. Hooker, arrogant and politically wounded after his defeat at Chancellorsville, found his strategic suggestions dismissed, his requests for reinforcements denied. The hidden tensions between field command and political authority, ever present in the Union war effort, now erupted into a crisis of leadership at the most perilous possible moment. While Hooker sparred with telegraphic dispatches from Washington, his cavalry commander, the youthful and aggressive Alfred Pleasonton, clashed with J.E.B. Stuart's Confederate horsemen in a series of swirling, dusty encounters near Brandy Station, Virginia. This, the largest cavalry battle of the continent, was a tactical draw but a strategic revelation. It signaled that the Union cavalry, long a laughingstock, could now meet the legendary Southern horsemen on equal terms. More critically for the narrative about to unfold, it prompted Stuart, stung by the surprise and the near defeat, to embark on a course of action fueled by a desire for redemption and glory. Lee's orders to Stuart were clear but allowed for interpretation: screen the army's right flank and keep in communication. Stuart, however, interpreting his discretionary freedom broadly, would choose a path that led his cavalry on a wide, encircling ride around the Union army, a ride that would leave Lee blind at the crucial hour. This was a hidden tension of personality, Stuart's flamboyant need for acclaim against the army's need for reliable reconnaissance, maturing into a decision with catastrophic potential. Meanwhile, the invasion unfolded with a stark, chilling clarity for the civilians of Pennsylvania. The neat, prosperous farms of the Cumberland Valley, owned by Pennsylvania Dutch and other Unionists, now witnessed the arrival of a hungry, if mostly disciplined enemy army. Confederates, many seeing the wealth of the North for the first time, requisitioned food, horses, and supplies, paying with worthless Confederate script or simple receipts. For some Southern soldiers, it was a moment of grim satisfaction, carrying the war to the enemy's bounty. For others, it was an unsettling experience, a glimpse of the industrial and agricultural might they were opposing. In towns like Chambersburg and Greencastle, citizens watched with a mixture of terror and defiance as the long columns of butternut and grey passed through. The social order was not just disrupted, it was inverted. The secure world of the North was revealed to be perilously fragile, its fields now hosting an army that sought its subjugation. The Union Army, shadowing Lee to the east, moved with urgent purpose but without clear direction from its commander. Hooker, his authority undermined, finally reached a breaking point. On June 27th, following a petty dispute over the garrison at Harper's Ferry, he offered his resignation to Washington. To his shock and likely secret relief, it was immediately accepted. The destabilization was now complete. The Army of the Potomac on the march in enemy territory was suddenly leaderless. In this vacuum of command, the choice of successor fell upon a man who did not seek it, a competent, unassuming corps commander, known more for his steadiness than his brilliance, Major General George Gordon Meade. Awakened in the dead of night by a dispatcher from Washington, Meade was informed he now commanded the army. His reaction was not one of triumph, but of grave apprehension. "Well, I've been tried and condemned without a hearing," he reportedly said. "I suppose I shall have to go to the execution." The ambition that drove Meade was not for fame, but for duty. His fear was of failure on a cataclysmic scale. His contradiction lay in his irascible temper and deep-seated humility, a man of sharp tongue and profound personal responsibility. Thus, on the eve of cataclysm, the opposing armies converged, guided by new dynamics. Lee, sublimely confident, pushed elements of his army eastward toward the state capital of Harrisburg, still unaware that Stuart was absent and that the Union Army, now under the dogged Meade, was closer and more concentrated than he realized. Meade, thrust into command, sought to divine Lee's intentions while consolidating his own scattered corps. He chose a defensive course, looking for ground where he could fight on his terms. He issued orders for the army to concentrate near a Maryland crossroads town, a place where many roads converged, a logical place to receive an attack or launch one. His order mentioned a secondary possibility, a place just over the Pennsylvania border, a town whose name now entered the dispatches with fateful casualness, Gettysburg. The early decisions were being made, not with the clarity of a chess master, but with the fogged urgency of men moving immense forces by instinct and fragmentary information. The irreversible consequences of these days of march and countermarch, of resignation and appointment, of glory-seeking and blind advance were already locking into place, drawing over 160,000 men toward a destiny that none had planned, but all would forever remember. The acceleration of events began not with a grand design, but with the simple human need for shoes. On the morning of July the 1st, 1863, a brigade of Confederate infantry from Major General Henry Heth's division, marching eastward from the Cashtown Gap, approached the sleepy crossroads town of Gettysburg. Their mission, according to Heth, was to investigate reports of a supply of shoes rumoured to be there, a precious commodity for an army whose men often marched barefoot. It was a minor logistical probe born of mundane necessity. What awaited them, however, was not an undefended depot, but 2 brigades of Union cavalry under the command of the tenacious and scholarly Brigadier General John Buford. Buford, recognizing the strategic importance of the high ground south of Gettysburg, a fishhook-shaped ridge terminating in 2 rocky hills, had chosen to dismount his troopers, using their breech-loading carbines to stage a delaying action. The first shots fired that morning were not the opening of a planned battle, but the spark that ignited a conflagration. Upon hearing the sound of growing combat, the instinct of commanders on both sides was to reinforce, to push forward. The incident had destabilized the tentative maneuvering of the previous days and now forced a fight. Heth, underestimating the opposition, committed more of his division. The Union Armed Corps commander, the beloved and pugnacious Major General John Reynolds, riding ahead of his infantry, arrived on the field, assessed Buford's grim holding action, and famously declared, "The devil is to pay." He immediately began feeding his arriving brigades into the fight west of town, near McPherson's Ridge. In these first hours, the character of the battle was set. It would be a meeting engagement, a brutal clash of wills where the advantage would go to the side that could bring forces to bear the fastest. Reynolds, embodying the aggressive spirit Meade needed, was shortly thereafter struck in the back of the neck by a sharpshooter's bullet and killed instantly. His death was the first of the command tragedies that would mark the battle, a loss that sent a shockwave through the Union ranks even as they fought. As morning turned to afternoon, the battle swelled far beyond anyone's initial control. The Confederate command, realizing a significant Union force was present, reacted with vigor. Lee, arriving on the field near the Lutheran Seminary, saw not a Baal's crisis, but an opportunity. The Union troops were arriving piecemeal. A concentrated attack could crush them in detail. He turned to the newly appointed commander of the Second Corps, Lieutenant General Richard Ewell, who had inherited Stonewall Jackson's legendary foot cavalry. Lee's orders to Ewell were discretionary but clear. Carry the hill occupied by the enemy if you find it practicable, but avoid a general engagement until the arrival of the other divisions of the army. This phrase, if practicable, would echo through history, a masterpiece of ambiguity that placed a crushing burden on Ewell's shoulders. The hidden tension of Ewell's promotion, his need to prove himself worthy of Jackson's mantle, now met its moment of truth. To the north, another Union corps, the Eichswein under Major General Oliver Otis Howard, had deployed on the high ground of Cemetery Hill, just south of the town, and extended a line north to a knoll called Blocker's Knoll, later Barlow's Knoll. Howard, a devout man known as the Christian General, sought to hold this flank. Against him came the Confederate corps of A.P. Hill, and pressing from the northeast Ewell's forces. The fighting became a sprawling, furious affair across fields, woodlots, and along the roads leading into Gettysburg. The Union lines, initially holding, began to buckle under the weight of coordinated Confederate assaults from the west and north. The pivotal moment came in the late afternoon. Ewell's men, having driven the Union forces from Blocker's Knoll, had the chance to press their advantage against the vulnerable Union right flank on Cemetery Hill. The hill was lightly defended. Its capture would have made the Union position on the ridges to the south untenable. But Ewell, cautious, mindful of Lee's warning to avoid a general engagement, and perhaps psychologically paralysed by the shadow of Jackson's aggressive genius, hesitated. He decided not to attack. It was a decision born not of cowardice, but of an excess of caution, a failure of nerve at the critical juncture. Meanwhile, the Union forces west of town, outflanked and overwhelmed, began a chaotic, fighting retreat through the streets of Gettysburg itself, taking refuge on the high ground that Buford had identified and Howard was fortifying, Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill to its east, and the long ridge running south to two smaller hills, the Round Tops. As dusk settled, the Confederate tide had swept the field, capturing thousands of Union prisoners and surging with a sense of victory. Lee, surveying the field from the cupola of the seminary, saw a Union army battered and retreating to a strong defensive position. He believed he had won a significant tactical victory on the first day, and more importantly, he believed the Union army was demoralized and vulnerable. In his tent that night, he conceived a plan for the morrow. He would renew the attack, striking both flanks of the Union line. To collapse it, he believed with the confidence of a commander who had consistently bested this opponent that he could still manage the outcome, that one more push would bring the decisive victory he sought. He did not yet know that Meade, arriving after midnight, exhausted and grim, would stand on Cemetery Hill, look at the defensive potential of the land, and utter words that would define the next 2 days. We may fight it out here just as well as anywhere else. The battle born of accident was now irrevocably joined. The early decisions, the search for shoes, the reinforcement of the cavalry screen, the discretionary orders, the hesitant flank attack had all led to this. Two massive armies collided by chance, now poised for a deliberate, apocalyptic confrontation on ground neither had chosen, but which history would now forever sanctify. The night of July 1st was a chiaroscuro of chaos and consolidation, a desperate pause in the storm. Across the darkening fields, the groans of the wounded carried on the still, heavy air, a terrible chorus that would become the battle's enduring soundtrack. In the town of Gettysburg, victorious Confederates occupied the streets, while Union stragglers hid in cellars and attics, awaiting rescue or capture. On the heights south of town, the Union army laboured with a frantic, determined energy. Under the direction of Meade's brilliant chief engineer, Major General Gouverneur K. Warren, and the steady hand of General Winfield Scott Hancock, whom Meade had sent forward to take command of the field, the defensive line took shape. It formed a formidable fishhook, the barb at Cemetery Hill, the shank running south along Cemetery Ridge, a low tree-dotted crest, and the eye at the two rocky prominences, Little Round Top and Round Top, on the left flank. Throughout the night, men shivered in line, dug shallow trenches, and stacked stone fences into crude breastworks. The army, so often defeated, was coalescing around a simple, powerful idea: stand and fight. Lee and his headquarters along the Chambersburg Pike convened his commanders. The atmosphere was one of confidence, but laced with the first subtle threads of discord. Longstreet, his massive frame a picture of solemnity, arrived with a deep-seated foreboding. He had reconnoitred the Union position. To his professional eye, it was a natural fortress. He argued forcefully against a frontal assault. His strategic doctrine, his very being, recoiled at the thought. Instead, he proposed a grand tactical maneuver: disengage, swing the army south and east, interpose it between Meade and Washington, and force the Union to attack them on ground of Longstreet's choosing. It was a brilliant, if risky, plan of operational artistry. Lee listened, but his mind was fixed. He believed the Union army was battered, that its morale was fragile. He saw not an impregnable position, but a vulnerable enemy to be struck and destroyed. "The enemy is there," Lee said, pointing toward Cemetery Ridge, "and I am going to strike him." The tension between the two men, the clash of the pragmatist and the audacious gambler, reached its peak in that tent. Longstreet, ever the loyal subordinate, would obey, but his heart was heavy with the conviction of impending disaster. The alliance between Commander and his principal lieutenant was now strained by a fundamental disagreement over the very nature of the battle to come. On the Union side, Meade established his headquarters in a small farmhouse behind the lines. His command style was a whirlwind of consultation and delegation. He summoned his corps commanders, a mix of the steady, the volatile, and the untested. There was the reliable Hancock of the Second Corps, the irascible and politically powerful Daniel Sickles of the Third Corps, the solid and dependable John Sedgwick of the Sixth Corps, still marching hard to reach the field. Meade's plan was purely defensive: hold the high ground, receive the attack, and counterpunch if opportunity arose. It was a plan that played to his army's growing strength in position, and to the historical reality that in this war, the defender, armed with rifled muskets, held a terrible advantage. But within this plan lay a critical vulnerability, born of personality and ambition. General Daniel Sickles, a New York politician turned soldier, a man of murderous temper and towering ego, held the left flank of the Union line on the lower end of Cemetery Ridge. From his position, the ground to his front, a slight peach orchard and a wheat field, appeared higher and more commanding. Without orders, driven by a combination of tactical misunderstanding and a desire for independent glory, Sickles would make a decision that would nearly unravel Meade's entire defensive scheme at the moment of crisis. As the pale light of dawn on July 2nd crept over the landscape, the two armies beheld each other across a shallow valley. The stillness was profound, deceptive. Soldiers wrote final letters, checked their ammunition, and waited with the hollow feeling in the stomach that precedes carnage. The psychological strain was immense, a shared dread that transcended cause or uniform. For the common soldier, the grand strategies of Lee and Longstreet, the defensive calculations of Meade, meant little. They were men facing the intimate, visceral truth of mortal combat. They feared not the loss of a cause, but the loss of life, the pain of a wound, the separation from comrades. They grappled with the moral ambiguity inherent in civil war. The enemy across the field spoke their language, shared their history, and in some terrible instances were kin. This internal conflict, this strain, was the human substratum upon which the general's designs would be executed or shattered. Lee's plan for the day was a masterpiece of coordinated pressure. While Ewell's corps on the Confederate left would demonstrate against Culp's and Cemetery Hills, fixing the Union right, Longstreet's First Corps would execute the main attack. With his divisions under Lafayette McLaws and John Bell Hood, Longstreet was to march secretly down the unseen reverse slope of Seminary Ridge, form a massive striking column, and slam into the Union left flank, which Lee believed rested on the southern end of Cemetery Ridge. It was a classic hammer-blow flank attack designed to roll up the Union line. But the plan immediately began to fray. Longstreet's march was delayed, his columns taking wrong turns, their progress sluggish. The element of surprise, so crucial, began to evaporate with each passing hour. Lee, growing impatient, watched and waited. He still believed the attack, when it came, would be decisive. He could not see the growing unease in Longstreet, nor the precise movements of Union signalmen on the rocky heights who were beginning to report ominous dust clouds to the south. The events were accelerating, the machinery of battle was grinding into motion, but the cogs were misaligned, the timing off. The stage was set not for a symphony of destruction, but for a brutal, disjointed series of clashes that would test the nerve of every man from private to general, as the battle entered its second, and most bloody, day. The simmering tension of the morning exploded into violence in the late afternoon of July 2nd. Longstreet's attack, finally launched after agonizing delays, did not strike the Union flank as Lee intended, for the Union flank was no longer where Lee thought it was. Dan Sickles, in an act of breathtaking insubordination, had advanced his entire Third Corps nearly a mile forward from the assigned line on Cemetery Ridge. He now occupied a salient anchored at the Sherfy peach orchard on his right, running along the Emmitsburg Road, and bending back to a jumble of boulders called Devil's Den on his left. This forward position was a tactical absurdity, unsupported and exposed on both flanks. But it was ground Sickles had chosen, and when Longstreet's massive assault came roaring out of the woods of Warfield Ridge and Seminary Ridge, it struck Sickles's overextended corps with cataclysmic force. The collision was not a single blow, but a rolling tsunami of fire and steel that swept from the peach orchard, through the wheat field, and into the bloody maze of Devil's Den. The peach orchard became a hellscape of screaming shells and scything canister. Confederate batteries, expertly deployed by Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, enfiladed the Union lines. Sickles himself had his legs shattered by a cannonball, calmly smoking a cigar as he was carried from the field, his ambition and error having irrevocably altered the battle's course. His corps, fighting with desperate courage, was systematically torn apart. The wheat field changed hands 6 times in 2 hours, a swirling, chaotic meat grinder where regiments advanced, broke, rallied, and were driven back in a nightmare of smoke and confusion. The pastoral names of the landmarks, the wheat field, the peach orchard, Devil's Den, became synonyms for slaughter. Here the internal conflicts of command were rendered irrelevant. It was the fight of colonels, majors, and sergeants, men like Colonel Edward Cross of the 5th New Hampshire, who tied a red bandana around his head, knowing it made him a target, and told his men, "We must make the best of it," before falling mortally wounded. As the Thray Corps disintegrated, the crisis threatened to engulf the entire Union left. The collapse of Sickles's salient created a gaping hole, a pathway directly to the undefended crest of Cemetery Ridge and the 2 vital hills beyond it, Little Round Top and Round Top. At this precise moment of peril, the figure of Gouverneur Warren emerged. Riding to the summit of Little Round Top, he found it occupied only by a handful of signalmen. Looking west, he saw the glint of bayonets in the sun, the Alabama and Texas brigades of John Bell Hood's division scrambling through Devil's Den and heading straight for the unguarded hill. The truth of the situation replaced all illusion. If these hills fell, the Union line would be turned, and the battle, and likely the war, would be lost. Warren, acting with the instantaneous decisiveness that defines military genius, frantically summoned reinforcements. He found the commander of the V Corps, George Sykes, and begged for troops. The response was the hurried dispatch of Colonel Strong Vincent's brigade and the artillery of Captain Charles Hazlett. Vincent, a young, promising lawyer-turned-soldier, rushed his men up the rocky, wooded slope of Little Round Top, assigning regiments to the defence just moments before the Confederate onslaught hit. The 20th Maine, under the bookish and astute Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, was placed at the extreme left of the Union line, the very end of the fishhook. Chamberlain, a professor of rhetoric, understood that his regiment was the hinge of the Union army. If his line broke, all would be lost. For an hour, his 300 men repulsed relentless attacks from the 15th Alabama, commanded by Colonel William C. Oates. The fighting was hand-to-hand, a primal struggle among the boulders and trees. Men clubbed each other with muskets, stabbed with bayonets, and threw rocks. The main line, thin and running out of ammunition, began to waver. In this crucible, Chamberlain made a decision of sublime courage and tactical brilliance. With a shout of bayonets, he ordered a right-wheel manoeuvre, extending his line and charging downhill like a swinging door. The exhausted Alabamians, caught by surprise and outflanked, broke and were captured en masse. The Union left, by the narrowest of margins, held. The decisive event of the second day was not a grand, sweeping manoeuvre, but the desperate, heroic defence of a rocky hill by a college professor and his volunteers from Maine. While the left clung to its rocky bastions, the fighting raged northward. The Union centre on Cemetery Ridge, now reinforced by frantic plugging of holes by Meade and Hancock, held against secondary assaults. On the far right, Ewell launched his delayed demonstration against Culp's Hill and East Cemetery Hill as dusk fell. The fighting here was an eerie, close-quarters nightmare in the dark woods, muzzle flashes illuminating desperate faces. At one point, Confederate troops breached the works on East Cemetery Hill, threatening the Union heart, but a chaotic, furious countercharge by Ohio and Pennsylvania regiments hurled them back. As midnight finally brought a fractured, agonized silence, the lines remained largely where they had been that morning, but at a horrific cost. Over 20,000 men had fallen on July 2nd. Lee's grand coordinated attack had failed, shattered against the rock of Union defence and the improvisational heroics of its officers. Yet, in his headquarters, Lee interpreted the day not as a failure, but as a near success. He saw that the Union center on Cemetery Ridge between the two hills had been weakened, stripped to reinforce the flanks. He believed incorrectly that the Union army was on the verge of breaking, and so he conceived one final desperate gamble for the morrow, a massive direct infantry assault on the very center of the Union line. He would send George Pickett's fresh division along with elements of others across nearly a mile of open field to pierce the heart of Meade's army. The events had accelerated beyond anyone's control, and now they hurtled toward a crescendo of pure, distilled violence, a test of flesh against projectile, of will against fire, that would define the American memory for centuries to come. The pale, bruised light of dawn on July 3rd, 1863, revealed a landscape transformed into a tableau of sublime horror. The silence that had followed the thunder of the previous day was not peaceful, but suffocating, heavy with the scent of blood, gunpowder, and torn earth. Across the two opposing ridges, Seminary and Cemetery, exhausted men peered through the lingering smoke at a no-man's land littered with the twisted forms of the fallen. For the commanders, this dawn brought not respite, but the crushing weight of decision. In the Confederate camp along Seminary Ridge, a grim resolve had crystallized in the mind of Robert E. Lee. His interpretation of the previous day's fighting was a masterpiece of selective perception. He saw the near breaches at the peach orchard, the wheat field, and the slopes of Culp's Hill not as bloody repulses, but as evidence that the Union line was strained to its breaking point. The centre, he reasoned, particularly the sector of Cemetery Ridge opposite a copse of trees and a low stone wall held by the Union II Corps, must have been weakened to reinforce the flanks. It was a logical deduction, but fatally flawed, born of an overestimation of his enemy's disarray and an underestimation of George Meade's defensive acumen. Lee's decision, conveyed to his corps commanders in the fragile morning quiet, was one of breathtaking audacity, a massive direct infantry assault on the very centre of the Union line. He would hurl nearly 12,000 men, the fresh division of Major General George Pickett, along with brigades from Heth's division under Johnston Pettigrew and others from Dorsey Pender's division under Isaac Trimble, across nearly a mile of open, gently rising ground. The plan was shockingly simple, a reversion to Napoleonic tactics in an age of the rifle. Its success hinged on two fragile premises: a devastating preparatory artillery barrage that would soften the Union centre and cripple its artillery, and the sheer unstoppable momentum of the attacking column. When Lee outlined this scheme to James Longstreet, the atmosphere in the headquarters tent grew frigid. Longstreet, his face a mask of stony despair, protested once more. "General, I have been a soldier all my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know as well as anyone what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." The exchange laid bare the deepest fracture in the Confederate High Command. Lee, the gambler seeing one last desperate throw of the dice for ultimate victory against Longstreet, the realist who saw only a field of fire and certain slaughter. Lee's authority, however, was absolute. "The enemy is there, General Longstreet, and I am going to strike him," he repeated, his tone closing the discussion. The alliance between the two, built on mutual respect and shared hardship, was now strained to its limit by a fundamental, irreconcilable difference of vision. Longstreet, the loyal subordinate, would obey, but the moral burden broke something within him. He later wrote that he felt as if he were ordering the sacrifice of his men, a feeling of profound culpability that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. Meanwhile, the chosen instrument of this assault, George Pickett, was a man of a diametrically opposite temperament. Flamboyant, vainglorious, with perfumed ringlets cascading over his shoulders, Pickett saw not tragedy, but destiny. For him, this was the moment of immortal glory, the charge that would eclipse all other exploits in the annals of the Confederacy. His division, which had seen little fighting thus far, was fresh and eager. As he received his orders, his enthusiasm was unbridled, a stark contrast to Longstreet's funeral demeanour. Across the way, George Meade had spent the night in a council of war with his corps commanders. The consensus was defensive, hold the line, await the attack they all sensed was coming. Meade, correctly reading the battlefield, predicted the assault would fall upon his centre. He strengthened it accordingly, shifting artillery and reinforcing the troops of General Winfield Scott Hancock's Thackeray Corps, who held the critical sector at the angle near the copse of trees. The Union Army, for the first time in its history, fought with a unified defensive purpose, its commander and subordinates in rare harmony. The soldiers themselves, though exhausted, sensed a shift. They had held against the fury of the previous day. They had seen the enemy bleed himself white against their ridges. A grim confidence, hard-won and fragile, began to seep into the ranks. They improved their stone wall defences, stacked fence rails, and checked their ammunition. They knew what was coming. The tension that morning was of a different quality than before, not the anxious uncertainty of July 1st, nor the reactive chaos of July 2nd, but the dreadful, calm certainty of a storm about to break. The events had accelerated beyond the control of any single man, converging now toward a single appointed hour. The strategies were set, the pieces moved. All that remained was the execution, a test of metal and nerve that would unfold under the merciless Pennsylvania sun, where the illusions of invincibility and the theories of war would be replaced by the simple, terrible truth of massed firepower against human flesh. The morning of July 3rd unfolded with a tense, deceptive quiet, broken only by sporadic skirmish fire and the distant, haunting cries of the wounded still littering the fields between the armies. This lull was the calm before the hurricane, a period of frantic, hidden preparation. For the Confederates, the success of Lee's grand assault depended entirely on the work of Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, Longstreet's brilliant young artillery chief. Alexander's task was Herculean, to mass over 150 cannons along Seminary Ridge from the Peach Orchard northward, and to silence the Union batteries on Cemetery Ridge through a concentrated, overwhelming bombardment. It was a gambit based on the theory of massed artillery preparation, a tactic still in its infancy. Through the misty dawn, crews manhandled guns into position, creating the greatest concentration of artillery ever seen on the North American continent. The ammunition trains rolled forward, stacking shells and powder charges beside each piece. The gunners, many of them boys in their teens, checked their friction primers and adjusted elevations, their movements precise, their faces etched with the gravity of the coming hour. Opposite them, Union Artillery Chief General Henry Hunt, a master of his craft, observed the Confederate activity with a professional's discerning eye. He recognized the signs of a massive preparatory barrage. Instead of ordering his batteries to fruitlessly engage in a counter-battery duel, he devised a cunning, patient strategy. He would allow the Confederate gunners to fire, conserving his own ammunition and crews, and instruct his batteries to cease firing slowly, one by one, to feign destruction and lure the Confederate infantry into the open. It was a nerve-wracking plan, requiring immense discipline from men under a hellstorm. Hunt rode along the line, issuing quiet instructions, his calm demeanour a steadying influence. The Union infantry, hunkered behind their stone walls and earthworks, watched the enemy guns materialise with a cold, sinking feeling. They knew what the massing of artillery presaged. Men scribbled last notes, checked the alignment of their cartridge boxes, and offered quiet prayers or shared silent, grim looks with comrades. The psychological strain was immense, a terrible anticipation of being the target of an elemental force. At approximately 1 p.m, the world erupted. A single cannon shot from Alexander's line, a signal round, arced across the sky. Then, as if the earth itself had split open, the entire Confederate line vomited fire and iron. The sound was beyond description, a continuous rolling thunder that shook the ground and compressed the chest. For the next hour and a half, a storm of solid shot, shell, and shrapnel screamed across the shallow valley and tore into Cemetery Ridge. The air became a howling, deadly maelstrom. Trees were shredded, fences vaporized, and geysers of dirt erupted along the Union line. For the men in blue, it was a descent into a unique form of torture. They pressed themselves into the earth, seeking any slight depression. The concussion of the blast was physically sickening. Men were driven mad by the noise and the constant random death. A soldier could be speaking to a comrade one moment and be transformed into a red mist the next by a direct hit from a round shot. The very air seemed to thicken with smoke and the smell of burnt powder, reducing visibility to a few yards. Yet, Hunt's strategy began to work. Union batteries initially replied, but then, following orders, gradually fell silent. Seeing the slackening of return fire, Alexander, under intense pressure to signal the infantry advance, faced an agonizing dilemma. His ammunition was running dangerously low and the smoke was so dense he could not accurately assess the damage to the Union line. He sent a famous note to Pickett, "For God's sake, come quick. The 18 guns are gone." He was referring to a critical Union battery, but his assessment was based on hope, not sight. It was the decisive nudge. The truth was that the bombardment, for all its terrifying spectacle, had been largely ineffective. The Confederate guns, firing from a lower elevation, had overshot the main Union infantry line, their shot ploughing into the rear areas or burying themselves harmlessly in the soft earth of the ridge slope. The Union artillery, though silent, was largely intact, its crews sheltered and waiting. The grand premise of Lee's plan, the crippling of the Union centre, was already a catastrophic illusion, shattered by terrain, smoke, and the shrewd tactics of Henry Hunt. The stage, however, was set. The thunderous overture was concluding. In the sheltered woods behind Seminary Ridge, George Pickett received Longstreet's sombre, unspoken order. The moment had come. The pageantry of death was about to give way to its infantry executioners. The fate of nations now rested on the courage of thousands of men ordered to walk into the mouth of a dragon that had not been slain, but was merely biding its time, licking its lips behind a stone wall on a sun-drenched ridge. Following the ebb of the cannonade, a profound, ringing silence descended over the field, more unnerving than the preceding storm. The smoke began to lazily drift and thin, revealing a scarred, alien landscape. Then, from the woods on Seminary Ridge, a new sight emerged that would etch itself forever into the memory of those who witnessed it. Longstreet, unable to speak the order himself, had merely nodded his assent to Pickett. With a flourish, Pickett mounted his horse and rode to the front of his division. "Up, men, and to your posts," he cried. "Don't forget today that you are from old Virginia." The brigades of Garnett, Kemper, and Armistead formed their lines with a discipline that was both magnificent and terrible. To their left, the divisions of Pettigrew and Trimble, containing men from North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee, emerged as well. In total, nearly 12,000 men began to array themselves in a battlefront nearly a mile wide. The sight was breathtaking. Battle flags, bright splashes of red and blue, hung limp in the still air before being lifted. Sunlight glinted on bayonets fixed to tens of thousands of rifle barrels. The line dressed itself with ceremonial precision, a spectacle of martial order. For the Confederate soldiers, this was the pinnacle of their service, the grand charge they had been promised. They believed the artillery had done its work. They trusted in Lee, in their officers, in their own invincible spirit. As they stepped out from the cover of the trees and started their descent into the shallow valley, a great spontaneous rebel yell erupted, a high, piercing, feral sound that rolled across the field like a wave. It was a sound meant to terrify the enemy and embolden themselves, a final psychic weapon before the physical contest began. On Cemetery Ridge, Union soldiers, shaking off the stupor of the bombardment, peered through the dissipating smoke. What they saw first was the forest of flags, then the dark, shifting mass of humanity emerging from the distant tree line. A low murmur, then shouts of "Here they come!" rippled down the blue line. Officers, cool and steady, called out, "Hold your fire, men, wait for the order." Artillerymen like Lieutenant Alonzo Cushing, whose battery was positioned at the very angle, feverishly rolled their guns back into position, swabbed out barrels, and loaded with double canister, tin cans filled with hundreds of iron balls that turned a cannon into a giant shotgun. The psychological dynamic had flipped. The passive, terrifying anxiety of enduring shell fire was replaced by the active, focused tension of the hunter awaiting the prey entering the kill zone. The Confederate advance was initially a picture of majestic order. They descended the slope of Seminary Ridge, crossed the Emmitsburg Road, and began the long, gradual ascent toward the Union center. The pace was steady, deliberate, a walk into destiny. Almost immediately, however, the plan's flaws became apparent. The rolling terrain and fences along the road caused the elegant line to compress and bunch. Gaps appeared between Pickett's Virginians on the right and Pettigrew's North Carolinians on the left. More critically, they entered the killing field. Union artillery, silent and preserved, now opened fire. First one gun, then another, then entire batteries unleashed a storm of shell and spherical case shot that began to plough bloody furrows through the advancing ranks. Gaps opened, men disappeared, but the lines closed up and marched on, their flags dipping and rising as colour-bearers fell and were replaced. Halfway across, the Union infantry, behind their stone wall, could wait no longer. A volley from the Vermont Brigade ripped into Kemper's flank. Then, the main line, at a command, rose as one and unleashed a crashing, rolling volley of musket fire. The sound was a sharp, tearing crack compared to the artillery's roar. Smoke billowed from the Union line. In the Confederate ranks, the effect was devastating. Whole sections of the line seemed to melt away. Yet still they came, the pace quickening to a determined rush, the rebel yell now mixed with screams of pain and anger. The focus of the assault, like a magnet drawing metal, was the slight outward jut in the Union line at the angle, marked by a small clump of trees. Toward that point, the bleeding, shrinking spearhead of the charge now directed itself, a testament to sheer, desperate courage in the face of geometrically increasing fire. The event had accelerated beyond tactics and into the realm of pure sacrifice. The strategies had failed. What remained was the chaos of courage meeting point-blank destruction, and the truth that no amount of valor could overcome the physics of massed aimed rifle and artillery fire from a defended height. The final terrible act of Pickett's charge condensed into a furious, swirling melee at a single bloody point, the angle on Cemetery Ridge. The Confederate advance, having traversed the slaughterous field, was no longer a coherent line, but a collection of determined knots of men, led by surviving officers and the tattered symbols of their flags. The spearhead, driven by an almost superhuman will, pressed toward the little clump of trees. Here, the Union defense was personified by men like Lieutenant Alonzo Cushing, who, despite a ghastly wound that had torn open his abdomen, refused to leave his guns. Supported by his men, he ordered his final rounds of canister fired directly into the oncoming grey tide before collapsing dead over his cannon. His sacrifice bought precious seconds. Over the low stone wall at the angle came the first Confederates. Leading them was General Lewis Armistead, Pickett's brigade commander, his hat raised on the point of his sword to rally his men. "Come on, boys, give them the cold steel," he shouted, vaulting over the wall with perhaps 100 of his Virginians. For a few chaotic, timeless minutes, they achieved the impossible, a breach in the centre of the Union line. Armistead placed his hand on a captured Union cannon, a gesture of triumph that would become legendary. But it was a fleeting, isolated triumph, an island of grey in a rising blue sea. The breach was shallow and unsupported. The flanks of the Confederate thrust had been utterly devastated. Pettigrew's and Trimble's men had been torn apart and driven back. Pickett's division was spent, its supporting units pinned down or annihilated. The Union response was swift and violent. General Winfield Scott Hancock, wounded in the thigh by a nail driven into his saddle by a bullet, remained on horseback, directing reinforcements into the breach. From the north and south, Union regiments wheeled inward like giant crushing jaws. The 72nd Pennsylvania poured in a murderous fire at point-blank range. The Vermont Brigade hammered the Confederate right flank. The brief penetration became a death trap. The fighting at the wall degenerated into a primal hand-to-hand struggle with clubbed muskets, bayonets, and fists. Men killed each other across the stone barrier. In the midst of this maelstrom, Lewis Armistead fell, mortally wounded. His last words, spoken to a Union officer, were said to be, "Tell Hancock, I have wronged him and have wronged my country." It was a moment of tragic pathos, a personal lament amid the impersonal slaughter, symbolizing the fratricidal heart of the war. Within minutes, the Confederate tide, having crested at the stone wall, began to recede. The physical and psychic energy of the charge was exhausted. The survivors, seeing no support, hearing the crescendo of Union fire encircling them, began to fall back. What had been a purposeful advance became a desperate, shattered retreat. The order and courage of the march out were gone, replaced by a frantic scramble for survival. Men ran, stumbled, and crawled back across the same field, now even more deadly as Union artillery, and riflemen poured fire into their retreating backs. The glorious charge had become a bloody rout. Across the field, George Pickett watched from Seminary Ridge, weeping as his shattered division streamed back. To an aide who asked about the state of his division, he replied bitterly, "All that is left of it." On Cemetery Ridge, a strange, suspended moment followed. The Union soldiers, adrenalized and amazed, watched the backs of their enemies recede. Then a cheer began, not the shrill rebel yell, but a deep, thunderous roar of victory and relief that rolled along the entire line. They had done it. They had held. For the Army of the Potomac, it was a cathartic, transformative sound. This was the decisive event that permanently altered the course of the war. Lee's final, desperate gamble had not just failed, it had been annihilated. The offensive power of the Army of Northern Virginia, the aura of Lee's invincibility, was broken on the slopes of that ridge. The truth replaced illusion. The defensive, with rifled muskets and artillery, held a supreme advantage. The high water mark of the Confederacy had been reached, had lapped against the stone wall and was now receding forever. The immediate fallout was a field carpeted with the fallen, over 5,000 Confederate casualties in less than an hour, stacked in heaps and windrows, a testament to the folly of the assault and the grim efficiency of the defence. The battle, though not yet officially over, had reached its brutal, unambiguous climax. The immediate fallout of the repulse was a scene of stunned silence on Seminary Ridge, broken by the agonized cries of the thousands left stranded on the field. In the Confederate High Command, the atmosphere was one of profound shock and dawning catastrophe. Robert E. Lee, mounted on Traveller, rode out to meet the shattered remnants of his command as they streamed back. His demeanour was the picture of sublime, tragic responsibility. To a weeping General Pickett, who tried to rally his men, Lee said, "General, you must look after your division." When Pickett gasped, "General Lee, I have no division," Lee replied, "Come, General Pickett, this has been my fight, and upon my shoulders rests the blame." To the broken ranks he repeated, "It is all my fault, all my fault." It was an act of supreme command nobility, accepting the burden of a decision that had just consigned the flower of his army to death or capture. But the words, while salving the wounds of his soldiers, could not alter the strategic reality. The army's offensive power was spent. The great invasion of the North had reached its disastrous terminus. Across the way, George Meade, cautious to a fault, emerged from his headquarters. Riding to the front along Cemetery Ridge, he was met by ecstatic officers and cheering soldiers who grasped his hand and hailed him as the saviour of the Union. Yet, Meade's victory was tempered by his innate conservatism and the sheer, overwhelming scale of the destruction before him. He knew Lee's army was wounded, but he also knew it was still dangerous, a cornered lion with sharp claws. His own army was exhausted, bloodied, and disorganized from its defensive struggle. When an exuberant General Hancock, despite his wound, urged an immediate counterattack to finish Lee off, Meade demurred. The moment for a war-ending aggressive pursuit was there, a fleeting chance to replicate the decisive blows of Napoleonic legend. But Meade, the engineer, saw the risks, his own casualties, the disarray of his command, the unbroken strength of Confederate artillery on the ridge. He chose consolidation over annihilation. It was a decision for which he would face eternal historical scrutiny, a failure to transform a decisive tactical victory into a total strategic one. On the field itself, the human cost of the charge became hideously apparent as the smoke cleared. The gentle slope between the ridges was a panorama of suffering almost beyond human comprehension. Over 7,000 men, Confederate and Union, lay dead or wounded from the day's fighting, with the majority fallen during the hour of the assault. The wounded, parched and bleeding under the July sun, called piteously for water, for help, for their mothers. Between the lines, a strained, informal truce began as soldiers from both sides, overcome by common humanity, ventured out to offer canteens and comfort to the suffering. This silent fellowship amidst the carnage was a stark, poignant contrast to the ordered violence of an hour before, highlighting the war's deep tragedy. Lee, ever the pragmatist even in disaster, immediately turned his mind to the imperative of survival. His army, though shattered, must escape. He ordered a defensive line formed, expecting a crushing Union counter-thrust that, thanks to Meade's caution, never came in full force. That night, under cover of darkness and a torrential rainstorm that began to fall as if heaven itself wept for the fallen, the Confederate army began its grim retreat south. The wagons, loaded with wounded, creaked and slithered down muddy roads toward the Potomac River. The long, dolorous procession was a mirror image of the confident invasion columns of just weeks prior, now weighed down by defeat and suffering. For the soldiers of both armies, the night of July 3rd was a time for confronting the outcomes of their actions. In the Union camps there was a subdued, weary euphoria, mixed with the sombre task of tending to their own wounded and counting the missing. In the Confederate bivouacs, a deep, bewildered gloom prevailed. Men who had believed victory and independence were within their grasp now faced the bitter truth of catastrophic failure. The psychological strain of the charge, the sight of friends swept away, the knowledge of a campaign lost, settled upon them like a physical weight. The long-term impact on the people, systems, and memory of the nation was, in that moment, still nebulous. But the soldiers sensed a shift in the war's momentum. The Confederacy had thrown its mightiest blow and had been broken against the anvil of Union defense. The enduring significance of the events of those 3 days was not yet fully understood, but the men who had survived the fury at the angle, who had heard the cheers and the rebel yells fade into the rain, knew they had passed through a fire that would define them and their country for all time. The battle was over. The reckoning for the armies and the nation was just beginning. The dawn of July 4th, 1863 broke over a field that was less a battlefield than a vast open-air charnel house. A heavy, steady rain began to fall in the pre-dawn darkness, as if the sky sought to wash away the blood but could only turn the clay-rich soil into a slick, crimson mire. The thunder of cannon was replaced by the pitiful chorus of thousands of wounded men, their cries rising from the wheat fields, the rocky slopes of Little Round Top, and especially from the killing ground before Cemetery Ridge. For the living, the immediate fallout of the previous day's cataclysm was a monumental task of triage and survival. The two armies, locked in a deadly embrace for 3 days, now existed in a state of exhausted, watchful separation, separated by a landscape of the dead and dying. The Union Army held its ridges, too battered and spent to launch a pursuit. The Confederate Army clung to its positions on Seminary Ridge, a wounded beast licking its wounds and gathering its strength for a desperate retreat. Within the Confederate High Command, the grim reality had settled with the weight of a tombstone. Robert E. Lee, his face etched with a fatigue deeper than mere physical tiredness, oversaw the heartbreaking but necessary preparations for withdrawal. His ambition for a war-ending victory on northern soil had evaporated, replaced by the stark, simple ambition of preserving the Army of Northern Virginia as a fighting force. The contradictions of his character were laid bare. The man who had ordered the audacious, failed charge now displayed a preternatural calm and administrative diligence in planning the retreat, embodying both the gambler who had lost and the paternal commander determined to save what remained of his military family. His fears were no longer abstract. They were immediate and visceral. A routed army, a trapped army, the end of the Confederacy. He worked through the day, issuing orders for the wagon trains of wounded to begin the tortuous journey southwest toward the Potomac River and the hoped-for safety of Virginia. Opposite him, George Meade confronted the outcomes of his own actions. He had achieved what no other Union commander had, a clear, decisive victory over Robert E. Lee on a contested field. The telegrams of congratulations from Washington began to arrive, President Lincoln's relief palpable in the formal text. Yet, Meade's headquarters was not a scene of celebration, but of grim calculation and simmering tension. His decision not to launch an immediate counterattack on the afternoon of the 3rd, or a dawn assault on the 4th, was already being questioned by his more aggressive subordinates, and, subtly, by the communiques from the capital. The alliance between Meade and his corps commanders, solidified in defence, now showed cracks under the pressure of pursuit. Officers like Winfield Scott Hancock, though wounded, urged aggressive action. Meade, ever the engineer, saw the practical obstacles, his own army's exhaustion, the mud-clogged roads, the still formidable Confederate artillery rearguard. His caution, born of responsibility, clashed with the political and strategic hunger for annihilation. Between the lines, the human cost manifested in scenes of biblical horror. Over 22,000 wounded men from both armies lay scattered across dozens of square miles. Makeshift hospitals had sprung up in every barn, church, and farmhouse for miles around. The Lutheran seminary, the angle, the Wycott farm, all were transformed into chambers of agony where overworked surgeons, their sleeves rolled up and aprons black with blood, worked around the clock with saw and knife. The sounds were not of battle but of suffering, the low moaning, the sudden screams, the monotonous sound of bone being sawed. Civilians from Gettysburg, particularly the women, emerged from their cellars to confront a world transformed. They brought water, bread, and linen for bandages, moving through the hellscape with a numb, purposeful grace. A young girl might find herself holding the hand of a dying boy from Georgia, while a farmer helped bury Union and Confederate dead side by side in his orchard. The social order was not just disrupted, it was inverted in a crucible of common mercy, where the labels of North and South fell away before the universal fact of shattered youth and mortal pain. For the common soldier, the day was one of surreal limbo. In the Union ranks there was a profound, weary gratitude for survival, mixed with grief for lost messmates. Men wrote letters home, their words oscillating between pride in victory and trauma at what they had witnessed. In the Confederate lines, a deep, bewildered despondency reigned. The shock of Pickett's repulse was total. Men who had believed themselves invincible now sat in the rain, hollow-eyed, clutching rifles they knew had failed. The psychological strain of the retreat, leaving behind their wounded, admitting defeat, began to weigh upon them. The long-term impact on these individuals was already taking root. For some, a hardening resolve born of shared sacrifice. For others, a broken spirit from which they would never fully recover. The systems of army discipline held, but just barely, as the will of Lee and his officers bound the shattered army together for one more test. The exodus from this field of broken dreams, back to a homeland whose future had been irrevocably darkened by the events of the first 3 days of July. By the late afternoon of July 4th, under the continuing veil of a soaking rain, the retreat of the Army of Northern Virginia began in earnest. It was a movement of profound logistical complexity and human misery, a far cry from the spirited invasion of mere weeks before. The wagon train, over 17 miles long, became the artery of anguish. Hundreds of wagons, carts, and even commandeered civilian carriages were laden with wounded men. Every jolt over the rutted, muddy roads elicited screams of agony. Men with shattered limbs, gaping abdominal wounds, and mangled faces endured a journey that was, for many, a prolongation of their death sentence. The rain turned the roads of Pennsylvania and Maryland into quagmires, bogging down wheels and exhausting the teams of horses and oxen. This procession of pain, guarded by cavalry and trailing the fighting infantry, was a stark symbol of the Confederacy's reversed fortunes. Lee's plan was to fall back to the Potomac River at Williamsport, Maryland, where he expected to find his pontoon bridges intact and foraging parties waiting. However, events accelerated beyond his control in ways he had not foreseen. The same rains that slowed his retreat also swelled the Potomac, rendering it fordable only at great risk and washing away his pontoon bridge at Falling Waters. Upon reaching the river, Lee found a raging, impassable barrier, his wagons and wounded accumulating on the northern bank, and the Union army, though slow, inexorably following. He was trapped with his back to a flooded river. The strategic situation had flipped from offensive invasion to desperate siege. Lee quickly ordered the construction of a fortified line on the high ground around Williamsport, a defensive perimeter that mirrored, in its grim purpose, the Union line at Gettysburg. His army, though battered, began digging with the desperate energy of men fighting for their very existence, their tools clinking against stone in the night, a sound of determination rather than defeat. Meade's Army of the Potomac, meanwhile, commenced its pursuit with deliberate, cautious steps. The army was itself a wounded giant, needing time to bury its dead, tend its wounded, and reorganize its shattered units. Meade, pressured by increasingly urgent telegrams from Washington, pushed his corps southward along parallel roads, seeking to intercept Lee but wary of a sudden, vicious counterpunch from the cornered Confederate army. The tension between Washington's desire for a war-ending blow and Meade's professional caution created a toxic atmosphere of second-guessing. President Lincoln, upon learning Lee was trapped at the Potomac, saw the chance he had long awaited. "We had them within our grasp," he would later lament. "We had only to stretch forth our hands, and they were ours." The alliance between the political and military arms of the Union, strained throughout the war, faced another severe test. Meade felt the weight of the president's expectation as a physical burden, yet the reality on the ground, exhausted men, atrocious roads, and a still dangerous enemy, dictated his methodical pace. The retreat and pursuit revealed the deepening internal conflicts within both armies. For the Confederates, the solidarity forged in victory was strained by the shared experience of catastrophic defeat. Fingers of blame, though not yet publicly pointed, began to be mentally directed at Stuart for his absence, at Longstreet for his reluctance, at Ewell for his hesitation, and ultimately at Lee for his gamble. The moral ambiguity of their cause, always present, was now underlined by the sheer, wasteful cost of the charge. For the Union soldiers, the pursuit stirred different conflicts. The euphoria of victory was tempered by the grueling march in the rain, the sight of abandoned Confederate wounded, and the gnawing fear that Lee might yet escape. Their trust in Meade was not absolute. Many in the ranks, echoing Lincoln, wondered why they were not moving faster to finish the job. By July 12th, Meade's army had closed in, confronting Lee's formidable defensive works at Williamsport. A council of war that night revealed the profound psychological strain on the Union command. Meade, surveying strong entrenchments and remembering the terrible cost of attacking at Fredericksburg and Gettysburg, proposed a reconnaissance in force rather than a full-scale assault. His generals, weary and mindful of their own depleted numbers, largely agreed. It was a decision born of professional calculation, but also of the caution that had seeped into the army's bones after years of defeat. When, on July 13th, Union probes discovered that Lee's army, under cover of darkness and an expertly engineered new pontoon bridge, had escaped across the still high but passable Potomac, a profound sense of missed opportunity swept through the Union ranks and the Northern public. The decisive event at Gettysburg had not led to the decisive annihilation of the enemy army. The victory, though monumental, was incomplete. The war would continue, but its trajectory had been permanently altered. The truth of Gettysburg was not just Union triumph, but Confederate survival, not just a battle won, but a war still to be endured. The immediate fallout of the retreat was a complex mix of relief for the South and disillusionment for the North, setting the stage for the next, grinding phase of the conflict. The news of the victory at Gettysburg, coupled with the simultaneous capture of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River on July 4th, electrified the North after a long spring of despair. Newspapers printed extravagant headlines, church bells rang, and crowds gathered in town squares. The twin triumphs were heralded as the beginning of the end. The social order of the North, which had been strained by Copperhead dissent, draft riots, and war weariness, found a renewed, if temporary, sense of unity and purpose. The Union cause was vindicated. The sacrifices appeared at last to have meaning. Politically, Abraham Lincoln's administration, which had been weathering severe criticism, gained a vital infusion of credibility. The president, however, absorbed the news with his characteristic depth of feeling. His joy at the victory was profoundly tempered by the casualty lists and swiftly thereafter by his frustration at Meade's failure to capture Lee's army. He, Shiel, understood that the war's momentum had shifted, but the serpent of rebellion, though wounded, had slithered back to its den. His famous letter to Meade, a scorching indictment of the missed opportunity that he wrote but never sent, revealed the intense pressure and profound strategic vision of a leader who saw beyond the battlefield to the necessity of total victory. In the South, the news of the defeat travelled more slowly, a creeping shadow. When it arrived, it was met with disbelief, then stunned grief. The aura of invincibility surrounding Lee and his army was shattered. The social order, already stretched thin by inflation, shortages, and the absence of men, now faced a chilling new reality. The war was no longer a distant affair of glorious victories. It was a beast that had turned and mauled them on their own doorstep, and was now at their threshold. Diaries from Richmond and Charleston speak of a heavy gloom, a death knell feeling. The Confederate government, led by President Jefferson Davis, put on a public face of defiance, framing the campaign as a successful raid that had gathered supplies and merely failed in its ultimate objective. But privately, the leadership knew the truth. The loss of manpower was catastrophic and irreplaceable. The long-term impact on the Confederate system, on its morale, its diplomatic prospects with Britain and France, and its economic capacity, was a crippling blow from which it would never recover. The high water mark had receded, and the tide of fortune was now visibly ebbing. For the soldiers who survived and returned to their respective homes, either on furlough or through medical discharge, the battle assumed an immediate personal legacy. Union veterans carried with them the hard-won knowledge that they could stand against Lee and win. This confidence would become a cornerstone of the Army of the Potomac's evolving identity. For Confederate veterans, Gettysburg became a sacred tragedy, a story of unparalleled courage in the face of impossible odds, a lost cause narrative born in the very mud of the retreat. They carried not the shame of defeat, but the pride of sacrifice, a psychological refuge that would shape Southern memory for generations. The physical legacy was also starkly personal: empty sleeves, hobbling gaits, and the distant look in the eyes of men who had seen the elephant at its most furious. On the battlefield itself, the work of burial and clean-up began as the armies departed. The stench of death became so overwhelming that it could be smelled for miles. Civilians and details of Union soldiers, many of them from burial corps, undertook the ghastly task. Bodies were piled into shallow trenches, often with little more than a scrap of paper noting the number interred. The landscape itself was scarred, trees splintered to kindling, fields churned to mud, fences destroyed, and buildings pockmarked by bullets and shells. The town of Gettysburg, a community of 2,400, was left to cope with a burden of care for tens of thousands of wounded and the environmental devastation of modern war. The economic and social systems of the region were overwhelmed, relying on outside aid and the grim new industry of death tourism, as relatives began to arrive to search for their loved ones among the graves. Thus, in the weeks following the battle, its enduring significance began to crystallize in disparate ways. For the nation, it was a turning point. For the politicians, a tool and a topic of debate. For the soldiers, a defining trauma and triumph. For the civilians, a practical nightmare and a sacred duty. And for the dead, it was an end that demanded meaning. It was into this fragmented space, between jubilation and mourning, between strategic calculation and raw grief, that an invitation was extended to President Abraham Lincoln. He was asked to provide a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of a new soldiers' national cemetery on the Gettysburg battlefield, a ceremony set for November 19, 1863. The event would provide a frame, a moment of reflection, where the legacy of the battle would be consciously shaped, its meaning contested, and its memory directed toward the future of the nation that had nearly perished there on the rocky ridge and in the bloody fields. The late summer and autumn of 1863 saw the Battle of Gettysburg slowly transition from a living nightmare into history, and from history into myth. In the North, the process of memorialization began almost immediately. Photographers like Alexander Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan arrived within days of the Army's departure, their cumbersome cameras capturing haunting, silent images of the dead bloated in the sun, of shattered landscapes, and of posed soldiers standing guard over emptiness. These photographs, published in Matthew Brady's gallery in New York, brought the visceral, unromantic reality of the war, and this battle in particular, to the urban public in a way no written account ever could. The images of fallen Confederates in the Devil's Den, of a lone dead sharpshooter in the bloody lane, became iconic. They served not as celebrations of victory, but as somber testaments to cost, subtly shaping the Northern memory towards sacrifice and sober reflection. Concurrently, the effort to properly honour the Union dead, led by Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin, resulted in the purchase of land for a cemetery on Cemetery Hill. The task of exhuming bodies from their hasty field graves and reinterring them with dignity was a monumental, gruesome undertaking that lasted months. The very landscape was being reshaped, not by strategy, but by reverence. This act of reconsecration formalized the battle's legacy as hallowed ground for the Union cause. Plans were drawn for a grand ceremony in November, with the famed orator Edward Everett secured to deliver the main address. The invitation to President Lincoln was almost an afterthought, a request for formal brief remarks following Everett's exhaustive historical narrative. The systems of memory were being established, the physical cemetery, the ceremonial observance, the hierarchical order of speakers. In the South, a different, more internalized process of memory-making was underway. With no ability to care for their own dead on the distant field, Confederate loss was privatized, woven into the fabric of family grief and regional identity. Newspaper accounts and soldiers' letters focused relentlessly on the heroism of the charge, the personal gallantry of men like Armistead and Garnett, and the stoic endurance of Lee. The narrative of the lost cause found one of its foundational stones at Gettysburg, the story of unparalleled courage betrayed not by a lack of spirit, but by overwhelming numbers and material, a sacred sacrifice for a just, if doomed, ideal. This interpretation served a vital psychological purpose, allowing the South to absorb a shattering military defeat without conceding moral or spiritual failure. The hidden tensions and command failures of the battle were minimized or romanticized. Longstreet's reservations would later be amplified into scapegoating, while Lee's responsibility was absolved by his noble acceptance of blame. For the key characters, the battle's immediate aftermath was a period of reckoning and altered paths. George Meade, though praised, remained under a cloud of Lincoln's disappointment for letting Lee escape. He would retain command of the Army of the Potomac, but operate under the increasing shadow and eventual oversight of Ulysses S. Grant, brought east the following spring as General-in-Chief. Meade's contradiction, the victor of Gettysburg who failed to destroy, would define his historical reputation. James Longstreet, physically and emotionally scarred, saw his relationship with Lee cool, though not break. His post-war fate would be the cruelest, vilified by Southern polemicists for his perceived failure at Gettysburg and his subsequent cooperation with the Republican Party after the war, transforming him from a Confederate hero into a pariah. Robert E. Lee offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis, who refused it. Lee's letter cited poor health, but it was clearly an expression of profound responsibility for the defeat. He would continue to lead his army with brilliant defensive tenacity for nearly 2 more years, but the war of maneuver and invasion was over. Gettysburg marked the end of the Confederacy's strategic offensive. Henceforth, it would be a war of survival. Lee's fears of a protracted war of attrition, which he had sought to avert with the Pennsylvania campaign, were now the inescapable reality. The battle had permanently altered his course from the audacious strategist to the defiant protector of a shrinking cause, his ambitions narrowed to the simple, tragic goal of enduring. As the leaves turned in Virginia, the armies licked their wounds, and the nation, still divided, began the long, complex work of digesting what had happened in those 3 days in July, an event whose meaning was still raw, contested, and searching for its definitive voice. November 19th, 1863, dawned crisp and clear over the Gettysburg battlefield. A crowd of nearly 15,000 people, dignitaries, soldiers, civilians, and the merely curious, gathered on the hillside of the New Soldiers' National Cemetery. The air still carried the faint, unsettling odour of disturbed earth. The ceremony was a formal Victorian affair. The principal orator, Edward Everett, a former senator and the greatest rhetorical stylist of his age, spoke for 2 hours. He delivered a masterful classical disquisition on the battle, tracing the history of warfare from ancient Greece to the present, detailing the movements of the corps and divisions with precise scholarly detachment. It was exactly what was expected: erudite, lengthy, and safely historical, a eulogy that placed the event within a familiar framework of martial glory and republican virtue. Then, following a musical interlude, Abraham Lincoln rose. He had been ill, his face gaunt, his voice likely still touched by the weakness of what was probably a mild case of smallpox. He held a single sheet of paper. His address was over almost before it began, lasting approximately 2 minutes. In those 10 sentences, Lincoln performed an alchemical act of redefinition. He consciously and profoundly reshaped the enduring significance of the battle and the war itself. Everett had spoken of the details of the battle. Lincoln transcended them. "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here," he began with characteristic humility, "but it can never forget what they did here." With those words, he shifted the focus from the oration to the sacrifice, from the generals to the common soldier. He then redefined the war's purpose, not as a mere political struggle to save the Union of 1789, but as a test of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He framed Gettysburg not as a mere victory, but as a consecration of ground by the blood of those who gave the last full measure of devotion. Most importantly, he pointed the legacy forward, away from the past and toward an unfinished future. The task of the living was not to hallow the ground, but to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that of ensuring that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. The immediate reaction was mixed. Some newspapers, expecting more Lincolnian folksiness or fiery polemic, dismissed it as underwhelming. Everett, however, understood its genius. He wrote to Lincoln the next day, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Lincoln's Gettysburg Address performed the critical work of meaning-making for the Northern cause. It lifted the battle from a military event to a spiritual crisis and redemption. It tied the Union cause inextricably to the principle of human equality, thereby retroactively justifying the Emancipation Proclamation and framing the war's carnage as the necessary price for a nobler national rebirth. In the South, Lincoln's words were either unheard or dismissed as hypocrisy. Their own reflection on legacy was inward-looking, centering on the courage of the charge and the nobility of the lost cause. The two opposing memories of Gettysburg, the Union's new birth of freedom and the Confederacy's high water mark of sacrifice, crystallized in parallel, mutually exclusive narratives that would vie for dominance in the American psyche for the next century and beyond. The long-term impact on the systems of the nation was profound. Militarily, Gettysburg ended the Confederate threat to the north and established the tactical supremacy of the defense, influencing European military observers for decades. Politically, it secured Republican power and cemented the link between Union victory and the end of slavery. Socially, it provided a sacred origin story for a reforged nation, though one that would willfully ignore the Southern counter-narrative for generations. The battle itself became a site of pilgrimage, its topography preserved not just by fate but by the conscious decision to create a national park, a place where memory was literally mapped onto the landscape with monuments, avenues and markers. Thus, By the end of 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg had been processed from a chaotic, brutal event into a foundational myth. Its truth, the mud, the terror, the mistakes, the accidental collision, was overlaid with layers of meaning: sacrifice, freedom, courage, loss. The characters, from Lee to the lowliest private, became archetypes. The enduring significance Lincoln identified was not in the detailed recollection of events, but in the abstract, powerful ideals he attached to them. The battle ceased to be merely a historical fact and became a moral and political touchstone, a story told and retold to explain America to itself, a bloody ground upon which the nation's most painful contradictions were fought over, and from which its most aspirational ideals were, paradoxically, born. The sleep of the soldiers was eternal. The struggle over the memory of their fight had just begun. The echoes of the cannonade had long faded. The last of the unburied dead had been interred, and the fields of Gettysburg began a slow, natural healing. Yet for the nation and for the individuals who had fought there, the battle was not a closed chapter but a living wound and a defining genesis. The immediate military consequences were clear. Lee's offensive power was broken, the Union's strategic initiative secured. But the long-term impact on people, systems, and memory was a more complex and protracted drama, unfolding over decades. In the years following Appomattox, the veterans of both armies returned to a world forever altered. They carried the battle within them, in the physical form of empty sleeves and limping gaits, and in the psychological scars of memories that would surface in the quiet of night or in the sudden panic triggered by a thunderclap. For these men, Gettysburg was not an abstraction of strategy or a site of pilgrimage. It was the place where their youth had been incinerated, where friends had vanished, and where their own mortality had been etched into their souls. The process of institutionalizing memory began even as the veterans aged. The Grand Army of the Republic, the powerful Union Veterans Organization, and its Southern counterparts like the United Confederate Veterans became custodians of the battle's legacy. Their reunions and encampments were not merely social gatherings. They were rituals of remembrance, where the chaotic terror of combat was smoothed into formalized stories of heroism and sacrifice. Regimental histories were published, often funded by the survivors themselves, meticulously recounting their position, their losses, their moments of glory. These accounts, while invaluable, were inherently partisan and partial, constructing a mosaic of memory where each tiny piece claimed a crucial role in the grand tableau. The systems of veteran politics began to exert pressure on the systems of government, lobbying for pensions, for recognition, and for the permanent marking of their deeds on the landscape itself. That landscape, meanwhile, was undergoing its own transformation. The Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, formed by locals and veterans, began the arduous work of preservation and commemoration. The first monuments were simple, somber markers erected by states to honor their dead. But as the 19th century waned and the economic might of the industrialized North grew, the monuments became grander, more assertive. Bronze soldiers frozen in perpetual vigilance or dramatic charge began to dot Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top. Each monument was an argument in granite and metal, a claim on history. The Union markers, often funded by state legislatures, spoke of duty, preservation, and sacrifice for the Republic. The process was slower and more fraught for Confederate memory. Without federal or state support, Southern monuments relied on private fundraising and the passionate work of women's memorial associations, meaning their physical footprint on the field would remain sparser, a reflection of both their defeat and their later ideological triumph in the lost cause narrative. Within this burgeoning culture of commemoration, the key characters of the battle found their historical reputations hardening into myth or controversy. George Meade, though respected, never shook the perception of the man who won the battle but lost the chance to end the war. He was eclipsed in the national pantheon by Grant and Sherman, his caution interpreted as a fatal flaw. James Longstreet's fate was the most tragic. As the lost cause ideology coalesced in the post-Reconstruction South, a narrative that valorized the Southern fight as a noble, doomed struggle for states' rights, defended by flawless Christian knights like Lee and Jackson, a scapegoat was needed for the defeat at Gettysburg. Longstreet, with his post-war criticism of Lee, his cooperation with Republican governments, and his conversion to Catholicism, was perfect for the role. He was systematically vilified by former comrades like Jubal Early and others in the Southern Historical Society, painted as the disobedient, sluggish general whose failure to attack with vigor on July 2nd doomed the Confederate cause. This was a profound corruption of memory, where complex military disagreements were rewritten as moral failures to protect the sanctity of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee himself underwent a remarkable apotheosis. In the North, he became the noble adversary, his skill and character a testament to the quality of the foe the Union had overcome. In the South, he was transfigured into a marble saint, a figure beyond reproach, a symbol of the virtuous Old South that had never truly existed. His acceptance of blame for the charge was magnified into a Christ-like bearing of the sins of others. The hidden tensions, the ambiguities of his command, the very human contradictions of the man were sanded away, leaving only the icon. This sanitization served a powerful purpose in the reconciliation of white America, North and South. By agreeing on Lee's nobility and the courage of both sides, the nation could bind up its wounds without having to repeatedly confront the central, festering cause of the war, slavery. The memory of Gettysburg, in this telling, became a story of American valor in general, rather than a decisive victory for a specific, transformative idea of the nation. The reflection on legacy was thus hijacked in its public form by a desire for sectional harmony, a process that would have enduring and troubling consequences for how the battle and the war itself would be understood. The dedication of the battlefield to national memory reached its first great zenith on the 25th anniversary of the battle in 1888, and its most poignant on the 50th in 1913. These were not mere observances, they were massive national rituals, steeped in the politics of memory and the psychology of a fading generation. The 1888 reunion saw veterans, now in their 40s and 50s, return to walk the ground with a sense of proprietorship. They pointed out where their regiments had stood, argued over the precise flow of the fight, and saw the early monuments erected in their name. The event was marked by a spirit of martial pride, but also by the visible divisions of a still healing nation. Union and Confederates. Veterans held largely separate ceremonies, their memories parallel but not yet intersecting. The 1913 Great Reunion was an event of a different magnitude, conceived on a grand scale by the federal and state governments. Over 53,000 veterans, Union and Confederate, now old men with long white beards, descended upon Gettysburg. They were housed in a vast tent city erected on the battlefield itself. The explicit purpose, promoted by the progressive era's spirit of national unity, was reconciliation. The imagery was powerful and deliberately crafted, former enemies shaking hands across the stone wall at the angle, sharing campfires, swapping stories. President Woodrow Wilson, a Southern-born Democrat, addressed the crowd, famously and tellingly, avoiding any mention of slavery or emancipation, speaking instead of the quarrel forgotten and the honour of men who were once our enemies. The event was a spectacular success in terms of its stated goal. Newspaper headlines across the country celebrated the peace, the valour, and the reunited white manhood of America. Beneath this surface of harmony, however, ran deep and unresolved currents. The reconciliation was overwhelmingly a reconciliation among white veterans and the white nations they represented. The black veterans of the Union Army, the United States colored troops who had fought and died for the very meaning of the war that Gettysburg turned, were pointedly excluded from the official narrative and largely from the reunion itself. Their memory, their sacrifice, and the cause of emancipation for which they fought were erased from the ceremonial script. The Peace Jubilee was, in essence, a pact of forgetting. It ratified the lost cause interpretation by placing Union and Confederate sacrifice on a plane of moral equivalence, a shared tragedy of American brotherhood. This framework allowed the South to honour its heroes without confronting the central role of slavery, and allowed the North to claim victory while abandoning the commitment to racial equality that had been the war's most profound outcome. The systems of Jim Crow, firmly entrenched by 1913, were the living, brutal contradiction to the sentimental handshakes at Gettysburg. On the battlefield itself, the decades between the 50th and 75th anniversaries saw the completion of its transformation into a formalised historical park. The War Department, taking over administration in 1895, systematised the marking of lines, the building of roads, and the placement of monuments. The landscape was curated, its chaos ordered into a comprehensible outdoor classroom of military history. This process, while preserving the ground from development, also fossilised a particular interpretation. The focus was almost exclusively on troop movements, leadership decisions, and the experience of the white soldier. Park markers told visitors where this brigade charged and that battery fired, but remained silent on what the soldiers were fighting for or against. The enduring significance, as presented by the park itself, was tactical and sentimental, not political or moral. For the aging veterans, these later reunions were final acts of witness. They knew they were the last living links to the event. Their reflections were often deeply personal, a confrontation with their own mortality and the ghosts of their youth. A Confederate veteran looking at the field of Pickett's charge might remember not a glorious high-water mark, but the face of the boy from his hometown who died in his arms. A Union man on Little Round Top might recall not a tactical triumph, but the all-consuming thirst and the smell of burnt powder. Their private truths were often at odds with the public, sanitized narrative being built around them. As the last of them passed away, the final veteran of Gettysburg died in the 1930s. The battle fully transitioned from lived experience into history. It was now the property of historians, politicians, and a public increasingly separated from its reality by time. The legacy was no longer theirs to shape directly. It was entrusted to the monuments, the parks, and the textbooks, all of which carried the imprint of the reconciliatory, white supremacist consensus of the early 20th century. The long-term impact was a memory deliberately simplified, a story told to foster national unity at the cost of historical truth, setting the stage for future generations to rediscover the battle's more complicated and more consequential meanings. The mid-20th century witnessed the entrenchment of Gettysburg in popular American culture, a process that further abstracted the battle from its historical specifics and moulded it into a broadly acceptable national myth. This was achieved primarily through two powerful mediums, film and the written word. The 1950s and early 60s, a period of Cold War consensus and renewed emphasis on American unity, produced works that crystallized the reconciliatory vision of the battle. Novels like Michael Shara's The Killer Angels, 1974, though its impact peaked later, and its film adaptation, the 1993 movie Gettysburg, were monumental in shaping modern perception. While Shara's book was praised for its humanization of commanders from both sides, it largely operated within the traditional framework, a tragedy of brother against brother, focusing on the martial dilemmas and personal courage of white officers. The film, with its sweeping shots of reenactors in neat lines and its dignified portrayals of Lee, Longstreet and Chamberlain, embedded a particular romantic visual grammar of the battle in the public mind. This popular representation dovetailed with a continuing evolution in academic military history. Detailed studies of tactics, logistics, and command decisions proliferated, offering ever more granular analyses of why regiments moved here and not there, of artillery placements, and of the minute-by-minute flow of the fight. This scholarship was invaluable in understanding the how of Gettysburg, but often, like the park markers, remained circumspect about the why. The battle was treated as the ultimate military puzzle, a complex game of chess where the pieces were men's lives. This focus on the mechanical aspects of war, while intellectually rigorous, could have the unintended effect of further distancing the event from its moral and political stakes. The face of battle school, pioneered by historians like John Keegan, later sought to rectify this by plunging into the visceral, terrifying experience of the common soldier, but even this approach often remained within a framework of shared suffering, reinforcing the theme of a common American ordeal. Concurrently, the physical landscape of Gettysburg became a stage for the recurring American drama of commemoration and controversy. The placement of Confederate monuments on the battlefield, largely a product of early 20th century reconciliationist sentiment, became increasingly problematic as the civil rights movement fundamentally challenged the lost cause narrative. The 1963 centennial observances, occurring at the peak of the movement, exposed the stark fault lines in national memory. While official ceremonies again spoke of honor and reconciliation, Martin Luther King Jr. was delivering his "I Have a Dream" speech at the Lincoln Memorial, a direct invocation of the war's unfinished promise. The juxtaposition was impossible to ignore. The nation was honoring a battle that helped end slavery while simultaneously using troops to enforce the desegregation of Southern schools. The legacy of Gettysburg was not a settled artifact. It was a live wire in contemporary debates about race, equality, and national identity. Within academia, a new generation of historians, influenced by social history and the imperative of the civil rights era, began to aggressively challenge the old consensus. Scholars like James McPherson, in his magisterial battle cry of freedom, and others, forcefully recentered slavery as the fundamental cause of the war and emancipation as its defining outcome. This scholarly shift had a direct impact on the interpretation of Gettysburg. The battle could no longer be seen as a mere tactical contest or a simple tragedy of American brotherhood. It was the pivot point in a struggle over the existence of slavery and the meaning of freedom. The Union victory was reinterpreted not just as a military success, but as the necessary precondition for the Emancipation Proclamation to have lasting force and for the eventual ratification of the 13th Amendment. The new birth of freedom Lincoln invoked was not a vague sentiment, but a concrete revolutionary political change. This revision placed the previously marginalized black experience at the heart of the story. The role of Gettysburg's free black community during the battle, as caregivers, as guides, as victims of Confederates capture, gained attention. The critical importance of the USCT victories elsewhere and the terror their very existence provoked in the Confederate army at Gettysburg became part of the narrative. The long-term impact of this historiographical revolution was profound. It forced the National Park Service, the chief custodian of the battlefield, to undergo a painful but necessary evolution. Beginning in the 1990s, under pressure from historians and the public, the park began to drastically overhaul its interpretive programs. The old guns and tactics focus was expanded to include discussions of slavery as the war's cause, the experience of African Americans, and the political context of the fight. The reflection on legacy was no longer a passive act of remembrance. It became an active, often contentious dialogue about what the nation chooses to remember, what it chooses to forget, and how those choices shape its present. Gettysburg, as both a place and an idea, remained a mirror held up to America, reflecting not only who it was in 1863, but more importantly, who it aspired to be in the ongoing struggle to define itself. The closing decades of the 20th century and the opening of the 21st witnessed Gettysburg's legacy becoming a central battleground in America's ongoing culture wars, a contested space where history, memory, and modern identity politics collided with increasing force. The catalyst for much of this was the National Park Service's conscious decision, born of the new scholarship, to integrate the causes and consequences of the Civil War into its battlefield interpretation. This meant installing exhibits, training rangers, and publishing materials that explicitly named slavery as the war's root cause and discussed the role of race in emancipation. For many visitors and scholars, this was a long overdue correction, aligning the site's narrative with historical consensus. For others, particularly some heritage groups and individuals deeply invested in the lost cause mythos, it was seen as politicization, an affront to the memory of Confederate soldiers, and a betrayal of the reconciliatory spirit of earlier commemorations. This tension erupted into public controversy repeatedly. Debates flared over the flying of Confederate flags on the battlefield, over the wording on historical markers, and over the very presence of Confederate monuments. The statues and memorials placed in the early 1900s, which to their sponsors symbolized shared American valor and sectional reconciliation, were now viewed by a growing number of Americans as symbols of treason in defense of slavery and, by extension, of ongoing racial oppression. The battlefield became a literal and figurative arena where these opposing interpretations clashed. Proponents of the traditional military-focused view argued that the park should be a hallowed ground set apart from modern politics, a sanctuary for remembering the soldier's sacrifice, regardless of side. Critics countered that the battlefield had always been political, that the original monuments were political statements, and that ignoring the central political issue of the war was itself a political act, one that sanitized history. The long-term impact on the systems of public history was significant. The Park Service, navigating a political minefield, adopted a more nuanced and also approach. Interpretative programs sought to explain both the tactical events of the battle and the broader context of the war, to honor the courage of the individual soldier and to examine the cause for which he fought. This was not always a comfortable balance. Ranger talks could become fraught, as visitors from different backgrounds and beliefs brought their own understandings and misunderstandings to the field. The battlefield was no longer a passive museum diorama. It was an interactive site of historical engagement, where rangers acted not just as guides but as mediators in a national conversation about difficult truths. Simultaneously, the field of memory studies provided a new lens through which to view Gettysburg's endurance. Scholars like David Blight, in his seminal work, Race and Reunion, meticulously documented how the lost cause and reconciliationist narratives deliberately eclipsed an emancipationist memory of the Civil War in the decades after 1865. Gettysburg was a prime case study in this process. The 1913 reunion, the placement of Confederate monuments, the focus on military minutiae, all were seen as mechanisms for forging a national identity based on white solidarity at the expense of the black freedom struggle. Understanding this process allowed for a more critical reading of the battlefield landscape itself. Every monument, every avenue name could be analysed not just for what it said, but for when it was built, by whom, and for what purpose. The reflection on legacy became a meta-reflection, not only on what happened at Gettysburg, but on how and why generations of Americans had chosen to remember it in particular ways. This academic insight fueled a movement for a more inclusive physical commemoration. After years of advocacy, a monument to the Union's United States colored troops was finally dedicated at Gettysburg in 2003. Its presence on the field was a quiet but powerful rebuttal to the exclusion of 1913, a tangible acknowledgement that the fight for freedom was central to the battle's meaning. Similarly, efforts increased to tell the stories of Gettysburg's civilians, particularly women and African Americans, whose experiences had been marginalized in the traditional cannon and cavalry narrative. The enduring significance of the battle was thus expanding. It was no longer just about what happened between two white armies from July 1st to 3rd, 1863. It was about the community that hosted the carnage, the enslaved people whose future hung in the balance, and the long, tortuous journey of a nation trying, and often failing, to live up to the ideals for which so many had died. The battlefield in this light became a palimpsest, a document written over many times where the latest interpretation sought to uncover erased layers and reveal a fuller, more truthful, and more challenging story. As Gettysburg entered its second century as a site of national memory, its story fragmented into a multitude of narratives, each vying for authority in the digital age. The rise of the internet and social media democratized historical interpretation but also amplified conflict. Online forums, blogs, and video platforms became new arenas for debates that once took place in academic journals or at veterans' reunions. Enthusiasts could dive into hyper-detailed discussions of ordnance or uniformology, while activists used the symbolic power of the battlefield to advocate for contemporary causes, from racial justice to states' rights. The single reconciliatory narrative of the early 1900s was irrecoverably shattered, replaced by a cacophony of voices. This presented both a challenge and an opportunity, the risk of the battle's meaning being lost in a haze of misinformation and partisan noise, but also the chance for a more democratically shaped, multifaceted understanding to emerge. The physical preservation of the battlefield faced new threats in the 21st century, shifting from neglect to the pressures of commercialization and development. The once isolated fields now witnessed constant battles over zoning, sightlines, and the encroachment of modern life. The construction of a casino near the battlefield in 2006 and ongoing debates over cell phone towers and visitor centre placements highlighted the tension between preserving hallowed ground and accommodating a modern, tourist-driven economy. The systems of memory were now entangled with the systems of commerce and local politics in complex ways. Each decision about the landscape was a decision about which version of history would be prioritised, the pristine museum of military movement or a living community with economic needs. Within this evolving context, the key characters of the battle continued to be reassessed by historians and the public alike. George Meade benefited from modern military analysis, with many historians defending his post-battle caution as prudent given his army's condition, rehabilitating his reputation from Lincoln's shadow. James Longstreet's image underwent the most dramatic rehabilitation. Historical works, notably by scholars like William Garrett Piston, meticulously dismantled the lost cause libels against him, portraying him as a capable, modern-minded officer whose advice to Lee was likely correct. In popular culture, films and books began to depict Longstreet sympathetically, transforming him from the villain of Gettysburg into its tragic, prescient figure. Robert E. Lee, meanwhile, faced a more critical re-evaluation. While his military genius was not denied, his role as a slaveholder, his decision to turn against the United States, and his strategic choices at Gettysburg itself were subjected to harsher, less reverential scrutiny. The Marble Saint was becoming a more fully human, and thus more flawed, controversial figure. The enduring significance of Gettysburg in the early 21st century seemed to lie precisely in its unresolvable complexity. It was too vast, too terrible, and too consequential to be contained within a single neat moral. It was a Union victory that preserved the nation, but also a human catastrophe of unimaginable scale. It was a defeat for slavery, yet followed by a century of institutionalized racial subjugation. It was a story of profound individual courage enacted in the service of causes both noble and vile. The battlefield as a place forced a confrontation with these contradictions. To walk the serene, manicured lawns of Cemetery Ridge is to be in the very spot where the idea of the United States was arguably saved. To look across the field of Pickett's charge is to witness the geography of a monumental, doomed act of faith. To stand on Little Round Top is to ponder the fragile margins upon which history turns. Perhaps the most profound long-term impact of Gettysburg is its function as a national memento mori and a crucible of meaning. It is where America faced the possibility of its own dissolution and, through staggering sacrifice, chose to continue. But what that continuation would mean, whether it would lead to the new birth of freedom Lincoln envisioned or a different compromised union, was the question the battle posed but could not answer. The legacy is therefore not a settled artifact to be inherited, but a perpetual challenge to be engaged. Each generation visits the field or encounters the story, and must decide for itself what it sees there: a tragic family quarrel, a technical study in leadership, the birthplace of a free nation, or the graveyard of a slave-holding republic. The reflection on meaning, then, is endless. The battle endures not because its tactical details are so compelling, but because the questions it raises are so fundamental. What is worth dying for? What is worth preserving? How does a nation born in an ideal cope with its foundational sins? The silence of the monuments, the gentle roll of the fields, the stillness of the copse of trees, all these invite not a definitive conclusion, but a continuous, necessary conversation. In this way, Gettysburg transcends its own history. It is no longer just a battle that happened in 1863. It has become a permanent part of the American consciousness, a story we tell ourselves about who we were at our most fractured moment, and a mirror held up to who we have become and who we yet hope to be. The sleep of the soldiers is eternal, but the struggle over the meaning of their sacrifice and the future they bought with their blood remains vividly, urgently awake. The immediate human fallout of the battle, once the armies had departed and the dignitaries had spoken, settled into a long, grey aftermath of adjustment and silence. For the maimed veterans returning to their farms, shops and families, the victory or defeat was an abstract concept. The permanent reality was an empty sleeve, a crutch, a cough from a lung pierced by Minié ball. The psychological strain, what later generations would term trauma or post-traumatic stress, manifested in ways the 19th century had no language for, in nightmares, in sudden rages, in a profound detachment from the rhythms of ordinary life. A man who had stood firm in the hell of the wheat field might now startle violently at the slam of a door. The internal conflict between the societal expectation of silent, manly fortitude and the inner reality of shattered nerves defined countless private struggles. These were the wars after the war, fought in the parlours and bedrooms of America, unseen monuments to the cost of the public clash. The landscape of Gettysburg itself bore witness to a more systematic form of aftermath. The commercial exploitation of the battlefield began almost before the last body was buried. Entrepreneurs sold fragments of shells, twisted bayonets, and photographs of the dead. Guidebooks appeared offering tours of the bloody ground. The very horror of the event became a commodity. Yet, alongside this grim commerce arose a genuine, if often sentimentalized, industry of remembrance. The construction of the hundreds of monuments was itself a major economic engine, requiring stonecutters, foundries, and labourers. Hotels and boarding houses expanded to accommodate the streams of veterans, pilgrims, and the merely curious. The town's identity became permanently fused with the battle, its pre-July 1863 history fading into obscurity. The event had become the town's raison d'etre, a mixed blessing of notoriety and economic dependence that continues to this day. For the political systems of the United States, Gettysburg's legacy was instrumentalized. In the North, the battle became a potent symbol in Republican Party rhetoric, a proof of the righteousness and ultimate inevitability of Union victory. It was wielded as a cudgel against Democratic copperheads who had favoured peace. The bloody baptism of the field was cited as justification for the harsh, transformative policies of Reconstruction. If so much blood had been spilled to preserve the Union and end slavery, then a firm hand was required to ensure those gains were not squandered. In the South, the memory of the charge, stripped of its context, became a tool for fostering regional solidarity in defeat. The lost cause narrative, which took firm hold in the decades after the war, used the courage of Pickett's men as its central parable, proof that Southern men were not defeated in spirit, only overwhelmed by brute force. This narrative was actively promoted by politicians, veterans groups, and groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy to defend social hierarchies, resist federal oversight, and justify the system of Jim Crow. The battle, therefore, was not a closed event but a living political weapon, its meaning contested in the legislatures and polling places of the reunited nation. On a broader cultural scale, Gettysburg entered the American imagination as the archetypal battle. Its three-day structure, with its clear narrative arc of initial setback, desperate crisis, and climactic heroic resolve, fit a compelling dramatic mould. It offered a gallery of archetypes: the noble Lee, the steadfast Meade, the doomed Pickett, the scholarly Chamberlain. It provided iconic, morally legible moments: the holding of Little Round Top, the repulse of the Grand Assault. In a nation eager for founding myths that could rival those of Europe, Gettysburg provided a foundational story of sacrifice and redemption that was both epic and recent. It served as a touchstone for understanding not just the Civil War, but the very concept of national sacrifice. When the United States entered new wars in the 20th century, the language and imagery of Gettysburg were readily invoked: the high watermarks of various campaigns, the thin blue lines holding against onslaughts. The battle's framework became a template for how America conceptualized its own moments of martial crisis. Thus, in the decades immediately following the conflict, the long-term impact of Gettysburg proliferated in countless directions. It shaped individual lives through trauma and disability. It reshaped a local economy and geography. It fueled competing political ideologies. It provided a foundational myth for a nation in need of one. The reflection on its meaning was not a solitary act of historians, but a widespread organic process involving veterans giving speeches, mothers visiting graves, politicians making appeals, and writers crafting stories. The battle had escaped the bounds of history and entered the realm of national memory, a powerful, malleable story that could be used to justify, to mourn, to inspire, and to divide. Its enduring significance was already apparent, but its final meaning remained tantalizingly, provocatively out of reach, destined to be redefined by each new generation that looked upon those quiet, haunted fields and saw in them a reflection of its own hopes, fears, and conflicts. The 20th century witnessed the hardening of Gettysburg's physical and narrative landscape into a form of secular scripture. The battlefield, administered by the War Department and later the National Park Service, was meticulously curated. Roads were paved, lines of battle marked with iron tablets, and vistas carefully maintained to preserve the 1863 view. This process of preservation was, in itself, an act of interpretation. It fossilized the battle at a specific moment in its historical understanding, primarily the 1880s, 1910s, when the veterans themselves were dictating the placement of monuments. The narrative embedded in the landscape was thus one of military maneuver and regimental pride, reflecting the reconciliatory, white supremacist consensus of the Jim Crow era. The cause of the war was politely ignored. The shared valor of the white soldier was glorified. For millions of visitors, this is what Gettysburg meant: a somber, beautiful park where brave Americans fought each other with tragic nobility. This official narrative was powerfully reinforced by popular culture. The century's most influential depiction came with Michael Shara's 1974 novel, The Killer Angels, and its 1993 film adaptation, Gettysburg. Shara's great achievement was to humanize the commanders, presenting them as complex, doubt-ridden men. The book and film, however, largely accepted the traditional military framework and character archetypes. They presented Lee as tragically flawed, Longstreet as brooding and modern, and Chamberlain as the idealistic citizen hero. While introducing nuances, they ultimately reinforced the battle's central place in the national myth as a drama of character and tactics. The film's sweeping romantic visuals, the serried ranks, the stirring music, became for a late 20th century audience the definitive look of the Civil War, further entrenching a conception of the conflict that was stirring, personal, and curiously apolitical. Beneath this placid surface, however, tectonic shifts in historical scholarship were preparing to rupture the landscape of memory. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s forced a radical re-examination of the war's core issues. Historians like James McPherson, in his magisterial Battle Cry of Freedom, 1988, forcefully recentered slavery as the fundamental, undeniable cause of the conflict. This scholarship had a direct and destabilizing effect on the interpretation of Gettysburg. If the war was about slavery, then the battle could not be merely a tragic clash of brothers. The Union victory was the indispensable military event that ensured the Emancipation Proclamation would not be a dead letter and that the 13th Amendment was possible. The new birth of freedom was not rhetorical flourish, but a description of a revolutionary political transformation. This perspective made the old battlefield interpretation seem not just incomplete, but actively misleading. The long-term impact of this academic revolution was profound and controversial. It forced the National Park Service into an existential crisis of purpose. Beginning in the 1990s, under pressure from historians and a changing public, the park initiated a sweeping overhaul of its interpretive programs. The old focus on flags and fireworks was consciously expanded. Rangers began giving talks on slavery as the cause of the war. Exhibits were redesigned to include the experiences of African Americans, both enslaved and free. The battle was now framed as a pivotal moment in the larger struggle for freedom. For many traditionalists, this was heresy, an injection of modern politics into hallowed ground. They argued that the park was for honouring soldierly sacrifice, not for prosecuting historical crimes. For others, it was a long overdue reckoning with truth. The battlefield became a new kind of confrontation zone, where tours could spark heated arguments between visitors holding fundamentally different visions of American history. This revision extended to the physical monuments themselves. The Confederate statues, erected during the era of reconciliation and Jim Crow, were no longer seen as neutral tributes to fallen soldiers, but as symbols of a specific oppressive ideology. The debate over their presence mirrored national controversies about Confederate memorials in town squares across the South. At Gettysburg, the argument was particularly acute. Were these monuments part of the historical record of the battle itself, to be preserved as artifacts of how the battle was remembered? Or were they later political statements that distorted the site's primary purpose? There were no easy answers. The Park Service's solution, to add contextualizing markers explaining when and why monuments were built, was a compromise that satisfied few completely. The landscape itself was now a text in a furious debate about history, memory, and race, proving that the battle's legacy was not a dormant relic, but a live wire in the American present. The reflection on meaning had become a public and often painfully divisive act. As America entered the 21st century, the digital age transformed the engagement with Gettysburg, democratizing access while further fragmenting its narrative. Online archives made soldiers' letters, maps, and photographs available to anyone with an internet connection. Sophisticated animated maps and virtual tours allowed users to visualize the ebb and flow of the battle from their homes. Social media platforms created communities where enthusiasts, scholars, and amateur historians could debate obscure points of tactics or share discoveries about individual soldiers. This was a tremendous boon for public history, breaking the monopoly of academic and institutional gatekeepers. Yet, it also created echo chambers where deeply held beliefs, from neo-Confederate mythology to presentist political analogies, could be reinforced without challenge. The battle story was no longer curated by a single authority. It was a collective, cacophonous construction, its truths and myths proliferating in the digital ether. This democratization coincided with and fueled a powerful trend toward the hyper-personalization of history. The focus shifted from grand strategy to the individual experience. Genealogical research boomed as descendants sought to trace a great-great-grandfather's path through the battle. The stories of common soldiers, long relegated to footnotes, were brought to the forefront. This history from the bottom up provided a necessary corrective to the great man focus of the past, revealing the battle's human texture in all its terror, boredom, and randomness. It reminded visitors that for every Lee or Hancock, there were tens of thousands of men for whom Gettysburg was not a chessboard but a visceral, life-altering ordeal of survival. This perspective deepened the emotional resonance of the place, making its scale comprehensible through the lens of a single, relatable human story. However, the emphasis on individual experience also carried the risk of losing the larger political forest for the biographical trees. A poignant letter from a homesick Confederate soldier could evoke universal sympathy, potentially obscuring the cause for which he fought. The shared suffering of the common soldier, a theme heavily promoted in the reconciliation era, could be invoked again to suggest a moral equivalence between the sides, sidelining the fundamental issue of slavery. The challenge for modern interpretation became how to honour the humanity and courage of the individual while steadfastly acknowledging the profound moral chasm between the causes of Union and Confederacy. It was a balance between empathy and judgment, between understanding the past in its own terms and evaluating it by the enduring standards of human liberty. The battlefield as a physical space faced new and paradoxical threats. Preservation efforts, wildly successful in protecting the core battlefield from development, created a kind of museum diorama, a sanitized version of 1863 stripped of the smells, sounds, and sheer filthy chaos of the event. The manicured fields and neatly aligned cannon presented war as a clean, orderly affair. Furthermore, the encroaching modern world, cell phone towers, traffic noise, the glow of streetlights, constantly challenged the illusion of historical immersion. The very popularity of the site threatened its solemnity, with crowded parking lots and tour buses sometimes clashing with the expectation of a reverent contemplative experience. The systems of tourism and preservation were in constant tension, struggling to accommodate nearly 2 million annual visitors while maintaining the site's integrity as hallowed ground. Amidst these challenges, new forms of commemoration and inquiry continued to emerge. Archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar revealed previously unknown details of troop positions and field hospitals. Environmental historians began studying the battle's impact on the local ecosystem, the deforestation from artillery, the contamination of wells, the long-term recovery of the land. This interdisciplinary approach enriched the understanding of Gettysburg as a total event, an ecological and social catastrophe as well as a military one. Meanwhile, the dedication of the United States Colored Troops Monument in 2003 and ongoing efforts to tell the stories of Gettysburg's African-American residents represented a slow, persistent correction to the historical record, a tangible commitment to a more inclusive memory. The legacy was no longer static, it was a work in progress, an ongoing conversation between the past and the present, where each generation used the tools at its disposal, shovels, documents, databases, or dialogue, to uncover new layers of meaning in the blood-soaked soil of Pennsylvania. The enduring significance of Gettysburg in the modern American consciousness rests not on a settled historical verdict, but on its potent, unsettling ambiguity. It is a Rorschach test for the national soul. For some, it remains the sacred ground of reunion, where the valor of blue and grey sanctified a reunited states. For others, it is the radical ground of rebirth, where the nation began to purge itself of its original sin. For still others, it is a sobering museum of military folly and the tragic cost of failed politics. This multiplicity of meanings is the battle's true legacy. It refuses to be pinned down to a single, simple moral. Its power lies in its capacity to contain contradictions. It is both a story of salvation and a story of slaughter, a moment of clarity and a fog of chaos, a foundation of national unity and a root of enduring division. The key characters, long frozen in marble or bronze, continue to be re-evaluated through this shifting lens. Robert E. Lee's trajectory is emblematic. Once the unassailable marble man, a symbol of noble defeat, he has become a figure of intense controversy. Modern scrutiny focuses not only on his generalship at Gettysburg, but on his fundamental choice to commit treason in defense of a slaveholding republic. His honor is now weighed against his allegiance to a system of human bondage, forcing a more complex, less comfortable assessment. Similarly, George Meade is increasingly seen not as the man who failed to finish the job, but as the competent, undramatic professional who, against steep odds, won the most important battle of the war. James Longstreet's rehabilitation is nearly complete, cast now as the clear-eyed modernizer whose advice, if heeded, might have altered history. These reassessments are not mere academic exercises. They reflect changing national values about leadership, duty, and the causes worth defending. The long-term impact on American systems is profound and ongoing. Gettysburg established at horrific cost the principle that the Union was indivisible. This constitutional reality has never since been seriously challenged. It also cemented the preeminence of federal authority over state sovereignty, a central dynamic of 20th and 21st century American governance. The battle's legacy is woven into the very fabric of the nation-state, Furthermore, the new birth of freedom Lincoln invoked, though brutally compromised for a century, established emancipation and later equality as the central, unresolved project of American life. Every struggle for civil rights from Reconstruction to the present day draws rhetorical and moral power from the memory of the war that Gettysburg turned. The battlefield is thus not just a memorial to the past, but a reminder of unfinished work. The psychological strain of the battle, once borne silently by individuals, now informs a national understanding of trauma. The concept of soldiers carrying the weight of Gettysburg has evolved into a broader societal awareness of the costs of war on the human psyche. The silent suffering of the 19th century veteran has given way to open discussion of post-traumatic stress, linking the experience of those boys in blue and grey to the experiences of veterans from Normandy to Fallujah. In this sense, Gettysburg serves as the primordial example of American combat trauma, its vast scale making visible a wound that is often invisible. Finally, Gettysburg endures as a masterclass in the fragility of events and the weight of contingency. It teaches that history is not inevitable. A different decision by Ewell on July 1st, a quicker march by Longstreet on July 2nd, a more aggressive pursuit by Meade on July 4th, any could have led to a vastly different world. The battle showcases how the plans of brilliant men are undone by chance, fatigue, misunderstood orders, and the sheer, stubborn agency of thousands of individuals. It is a humbling lesson in the limits of human control, a narrative that rejects facile determinism. In an era often seeking simple explanations and clear heroes and villains, Gettysburg insists on complexity. It reminds us that the most pivotal moments are often the messiest, driven by a chaotic confluence of courage, fear, genius, error, and blind luck, leaving a legacy that is never pure, always contested, and forever demanding our thoughtful, uneasy engagement. To walk the Gettysburg battlefield today is to traverse a landscape of profound silence that speaks in 100 different tongues. The air, once torn by the scream of shells and the roar of regiments, now holds only the whisper of the wind through the copse of trees, the distant hum of a tour bus, the murmured conversation of visitors. Yet, the silence is an illusion. The ground is loud with memory. Every granite monument, every iron tablet, every carefully maintained fence line is a sentence in an ongoing argument about who we are. The reflection on legacy here is not an academic exercise. It is a sensory, almost physical encounter with the past's persistent claim on the present. The enduring significance of Gettysburg lies ultimately in its function as a national crucible of meaning. It was the furnace in which the modern United States was forged, a nation defined not by common ancestry or ancient soil, but by a shared, bloody commitment to an idea, the idea of a Republican Union, and later, as Lincoln reframed it, a union dedicated to equality. The battle tested that idea to the point of destruction and found it, barely, strong enough to hold. This is why the battle transcends military history. It is a founding story of the nation's second founding, a searing origin myth for the America that emerged from the Civil War, more powerful, more centralized, and burdened with the terrible, glorious mandate to live up to its declared principles. The systems of memory built upon this ground, the park, the museums, the cyclorama, the countless books and films, are not merely preservative. They are interpretive engines, constantly working to translate the raw, traumatic event of 1863 into a story the living can use. That story has changed dramatically over time, from a tale of tragic fraternal conflict to a celebration of national reunification at the expense of racial justice, to a more recent and fraught acknowledgement of the battle's central role in the struggle for emancipation. Each version reveals as much about the era that crafted it as about the battle itself. Gettysburg thus becomes a mirror, reflecting back the anxieties, values, and blind spots of the America that remembers it. For the individual visitor, the confrontation can be deeply personal. A descendant of a Union soldier might feel a surge of pride at the 20th Main Monument. A descendant of an enslaved person might feel a complex mix of sorrow and resolve at the USCT Memorial. A modern soldier might stand at the angle and contemplate the nature of orders and sacrifice. A citizen might look across the peaceful fields and struggle to reconcile the beauty with the horror that once filled it. There is no single correct way to experience Gettysburg. Its meaning is negotiated in the private space of each visitor's conscience, in the dialogue between the preserved landscape and the personal baggage of history, family, and belief that every person brings to it. The long-term impact, then, is not a settled doctrine but a living process. It is the process of a nation continually arguing with its past. The controversies over monuments, over interpretation, over the very cause of the war are not signs of failure. They are proof of Gettysburg's vitality. A history that does not provoke, that does not unsettle, that does not force hard questions, is a dead history. Gettysburg is fiercely, uncomfortably alive. It forces us to ask, what is worth dying for? What is worth preserving? How do we honour courage without sanctifying an unjust cause? How do we reconcile reverence for the past with a commitment to truth? In the end, the battle offers no easy answers, only the solemn weight of its example. The silence of the dead, over 50,000 casualties in 3 days, is an imperative to remember, but also to think. The final reflection on meaning is this: Gettysburg is not a lesson with a clear moral, but a profound and permanent question posed to the American experiment. The soldiers' work ended in July 1863. The citizens' work, the work of understanding, of reconciling, memory with justice, of building the new birth of freedom that was purchased at such awful cost, that work is perpetual. As long as the United States endures, its people will return to these fields, not to find a simple story, but to listen to the complex, challenging echoes of their own creation, and to be reminded that the Union and the freedom for which it fought remains, as it was then, a fragile and precious thing, requiring constant vigilance, unceasing effort, and a courage equal to that shown by the men, blue and grey, who once made this ground forever holy and forever haunted.